For the last few years, I've been a cult leader. I know. It's not the most auspicious or honorable profession, but I had my reasons. I started the cult a couple of years after I got out of college. I was a theater major, which basically meant I spent 4 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars on a useless piece of paper. I was working dead-end jobs and being crushed by student loans. I needed a way to make money quickly. I figured the best way to do it was to start a cult and scam some folk out of a few bucks. The initial pitch of my cult was this. There was a demon named the Demovorn, who would destroy the world and leave only the sinless behind. The way to be free of sin was for people to give me, the sin holder, all their money. I would sacrifice myself for my followers by taking all their money and anything of value, because those things were sinful. It sounds silly to you, sure, but if you, like me, are charismatic enough, you can make some folk believe it. Add in some silly acts where I ride around and say the Demovorn is speaking through me, and, well, suddenly some rubes have fully bought into my phony religion. Hey, at least I got to put my theater degree to use. Within a few months, I'd gotten enough money from these rubes that I was able to pay off my student loans. Now, sure, I could have stopped there, but I got a bit greedy. I liked getting money, and I liked the feeling of power. Being the leader of a cult does absolute wonders for your ego, let me tell you. I bought an apartment building for my cult to stay at, told my cult to find jobs, and had them give me their salary to pay for everything. Admittedly, only a bit of money went to the apartment upkeep and getting food and supplies. Most of it instead went to fund my addiction to expensive watches and my separate mansion home. You might say that's scummy. But is this all that different from what landlords do? It's just capitalism. Besides, it's not like I was that scummy. I made sure my followers had food and shelter. When COVID came around, I made sure they all got vaccinated. And it's not like I'm one of those cult leader types who fucks his followers or leads them to suicide. I just want money. And really, is that so bad? Anyway, every year, around the summer solstice, I perform a ritual for my followers. We all go out to some empty field, put down some rocks and crystals to make things appear more ritualistic, and then one of my followers reads some nonsense I wrote down in a summoning book. As the gibberish is read aloud, I start to writhe around and speak in tongues, make random noises, and sometimes shout random words in different languages, ranging from Russian to Klingon. This goes on for around 10 minutes. Then I stop, stand up, and tell my followers, "The Demovorn has spoken through me. He says, to pay your sin holder more tithes," or something along those lines. It's all an act to add some more authenticity to the cult, and get me some more dough. It's a simple thing, and for the last few years, it had gone without a hitch. This year, though, something different happened. A day or so before the solstice, I'd tried LSD for the first time. I'd been getting so much money that I wasn't entirely sure how to spend it. So, earlier in the year, I figured I'd try some drugs. Did some crack, Special K, and ecstasy before I tried LSD. The trip wasn't too extreme. I didn't have all that much. Anyway, I arrived to the solstice a day or so after my LSD trip, got in position, and listened as my follower read nonsense from the summoning book. I started doing my usual thing, but then it seemed like my follower mispronounced a word, and at that moment I felt myself fall. I fell, down and down and down, until I hit a cold stone floor. I looked around, and found I was stuck in some sort of hole. I could see a pinprick of light, no larger than a pixel, miles and miles above me. Below me, I saw a red eye open on the floor. First one, then 2, then 10, then 100. The floor was covered in eyes, all staring at me. On either side of me, on the wall, I saw fissures open up. No, not fissures. Mouths. A dozen of them, 6 on each side, each filled with a maw of stony fangs. In front of me, another mouth opened, bigger than the others. The mouths spoke, one word at a time from each mouth, each with a different voice. "Wake me from mine slumber. What is it thou seek?" "The Demivorn is hungry, and thy soul begins to reek." I stammered uselessly, unsure of what to say or do. The mouths, in response, laughed in unison. "Lies are loosed from thou, spoken in my name. Thy sins are dark and many, done for wealth and fame. Now thy tongue is tied, my mouth closed in fear. The Demivorn shall speak for thou, for he talks without peer." The 12 mouths on my sides all let loose long tongues that grabbed my limbs and encased my body. The mouth in front of me then spoke. "The Demivorn comes, speaking through thy breath." I watched in horror as the eyes on the floor moved, crawling onto me and embedding themselves into my flesh. I screamed, but found my mouth was gone. Instead, I saw a new mouth open on my stomach and speak in the voices of the Demivorn. "Through thou, the Demivorn lives, bringing plague, war, famine, and death." And with that, I woke up back on the field, surrounded by my followers. All of them were looking at me with a combination of concern and awe. I noticed distantly that I was covered in sweat. I stood up and awkwardly cleared my throat. I said. "The, Demivorn has spoken through me. He says that the amount of tithes are fine, and you're all doing well. Really, really well." I left quickly, ignoring the confused mutterings of my followers. I went back to my home and tried to explain this away rationally. Maybe it was an after effect of the LSD. Maybe it was just a bad trip or something. Maybe the other drugs I'd been taking somehow mixed and led to this. I wasn't sure, but I decided to go with that. It made the most sense. I went into my bathroom and splashed some water on my face, hoping to bring myself back to reality. I looked into the mirror and then stumbled back in shock. I didn't see myself in the mirror. Instead, I saw some thing shaped like me. A being covered in eyes, with 6 mouths along each arm and a large maw on its stomach. I looked down. In real life, my body was normal. But in the mirror, it was that. It's just a trip. It's not real. It's just a trip. It's not real. I repeated to myself. In the mirror, I saw the mouths laugh. Fake, thou says. What a fool thou art. The Demovorn is no faker than thou, and much more real by far. I gulped. What do you want? A mouth to speak, a hand to hurt, a soul to call my own. Thine works well, and with thy hand, this land will be mine home. The children shall cry, and the rivers, they shall run red. And when the winter sun rises upon the land, all mortals shall be dead. It took me a few seconds before I understood. You're gonna use me to kill humanity by the winter solstice. Thy soul is black, but intelligence thy does not lack. I punched the mirror, the glass shattering and cutting my hand. I fell to the floor in the fetal position, hearing the Demovorn's laughter in my ears. At some point, I must have passed out. I woke up a while later, got up, and looked in the broken mirror. All I saw was my reflection. It must have been a bad trip. It was all fake. I breathed a sigh of relief. For the next few days, things were pretty normal. I made sure not to touch any more drugs, and just kept taking money from my followers. Strangely, I noticed that I seemed to have gaps of time where I couldn't remember what had happened. I figured it was because things were so banal that my brain just didn't commit them to memory. I shrugged it off. Then, about a week after I saw the Demovorn, while preparing to address my followers, one of them found me and asked, "Sinholder, why did you speak in rhyme earlier?" That brought me short. "What did you say?" I asked. My follower, worried he'd angered me, gulped. "Well, earlier, when you were addressing all of us, you spoke entirely in rhyme. Something I've never heard you do before, and it isn't in any of the texts. I was wondering why that was." "When was this?" My follower looked at me confused. "Just a few moments ago. Don't you remember?" I had no memory of addressing my followers. Last thing I remembered, I was about to address them. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted my reflection in the window. No, not my reflection. His reflection. My follower must have noticed my reaction, because he asked, "Sinholder, are you okay?" I cleared my throat. Yes, I'm fine. All I will say is that my actions are, beyond your comprehension. I have my reasons. Now, be gone. The follower gave me a slightly quizzical look, but complied. As the weeks and months continued on, I noticed bigger blank spots in my memories. There were entire days I was not aware of. I think the Demovorn was using my body more often than I was. In my brief bits of awareness, I noticed a plan forming. I saw blueprints for government buildings, plans for explosives, and caches of weapons littered around my home. He really was using me to end the world. I tried contacting the FBI or CIA to warn them about this plan. Before I was able to finish a call or email, I'd black out and come to in front of a mirror. I'd see the Demovorn in place of my reflection, all 13 mouths, smiling cruelly. I'm watching the clock tick down to the winter solstice, fully aware that I can't do anything to stop the Demovorn. The world will be purged of all life, and I know the Demovorn will sit upon the pile of ruined cinders that used to be the world and laugh. I can't stop him. I'm nothing more than a tool. His tool. The Demovorn is here, speaking through my breath. Through me, the Demovorn lives, bringing plague, war, famine, and death. Those of you who enjoy this story, be sure to check out the writer's YouTube channel, Black Volumes, for more horror stories and short films. Link can be found in the description below. For now, enjoy. For most people, a rainbow embodies hope. For the residents of my derelict seaside hometown, however, a rainbow invites only fear. Namely, fear that it might drain of colour at any moment. And every 20 years, it does. The townsfolk call it the Black Bow, an ominous arch that paints the sky, blotting the sun for 7 days. And the events that transpire are always unspeakably dreadful. You never see the phenomenon in national news, and it seems to be a self-contained event. Something only the townsfolk can see anyhow. But even if we were to tell outsiders, who would believe our story? A rainbow cannot be black or white. And the Black Bow is not really a rainbow. In late November of 2003, on the cusp of winter, I was a 14-year-old boy who was totally oblivious to the solemn faces of older townsfolk. Faces that I recall had been increasingly agitated with every passing month. Mum's being so moody, and for the whole of December we're going to stay with Grandma in London. Ronnie huffed. I wanted to go to Anna's Christmas party with you guys. This blows. So does your mom, Alex said. I giggled, and Ronnie kicked Alex in the shin. You're getting the whole month off school? I gasped. Ronnie shrugged. Guess so. Then why are you complaining? I laughed. If it makes you feel any better, my parents have been arguing a lot lately, Alex said. Dad said I need to see a therapist. They think I have depression. Ronnie and I awkwardly shuffled our feet, eyeing the ground. All I could think to say was, shall we go to the ditch to take your mind off of it? And Alex, being a young boy who had clearly mastered the art of masking his pain with comedy, eagerly nodded his head. Sounds good, Charlie, he said. So, we ran through the local park to the ditch, a chasm that had become a perilous playground for children in our town, and it was always busy. Hey, Ronnie, Anna called. Ronnie blushed and waved at his crush, who was swinging on a tire haphazardly tied to a tree branch. Her nearby friends giggled, and Alex pursed his lips, making smooching noises. I snorted and Ronnie sighed. Will you guys shut up? Our blushing friend grunted. You know why I was so bothered about that party. I was going to ask her out, but... A deafening crack sounded, and a chill coursed through the air, accompanied by an aggressive whistling noise. Is it about to rain? Anna shouted. Nobody answered. Our eyes were fixated on the shape that was forming above us. A colourless arch, larger than any rainbow I'd ever seen, tore through the clouds. I waited for red, orange, yellow, or any colour to appear. It didn't. There was only a towering black arch, an unstable monolith. It vibrated as if it were threatening to disintegrate at any moment. What is that? Alex whispered. I don't know. I gulped. Anna and her friends began to walk cautiously away from the ditch. She waved nervously at Ronnie, and he smiled back before returning his gaze to the unnatural thing above us. And then his phone started ringing. Hello? He said. Mum, What do you mean? Yes, I'm just at the ditch. What? I'll come home in... Why? But Okay, I'm coming home now. Flustered, Ronnie angrily thrust his flip phone back into his pocket. I have to go home, he said. Mum says we're packing and going to Grandma's right now. I don't think our teachers are going to like that, but... I pointed at the black rainbow. Is that why she's worried? Yeah. I've got to go, guys. She said she'll pack for me, but I don't want her to forget my Xbox. I guess I'll... see you after Christmas. Ronnie sighed, running off before we could say anything. Jammy dodger. Alex huffed. Fancy a go on the tire, seeing as it's free? Alex, don't you care that something's wrong with the sky? I asked. He shrugged. It's a rainbow. It's black. I don't like this. I think we should go home too, I said. Alex sighed, hanging his head dejectedly as we walked away from the ditch. And it was when we strolled through the park gates, which were swinging ferociously in the wailing wind, that we first started to notice things had changed on the ground, not just in the sky. It must have been early afternoon, but the rainbow had blackened the world beneath it. Lampposts had sprung to life. A car soared past at a frightful speed, swerving from side to side, whilst blinding us with full-beam headlights. "Idiot," I grumbled. As we followed the main road towards the town hall, the insanity only seemed to worsen. The piercing pitch of the wind had veiled the ruckus at first, but we started to discern the cries of the townspeople. More cars hurtled past. That was when the rain began to fall. Black rain. So thick and heavy that it shrouded what little visibility remained in the town. It started to collect on the bulbs of lampposts and the headlights of cars, gradually easing the world into a deeper realm of darkness. And each pellet of rain felt as if it might puncture my skin. There was an ill-meaning sharpness to it, an inescapable weight. "What is this?" Alex asked, nervously eyeballing the black, stodgy substance collecting in his palms. "I don't know," I said, pulling my hood up. "But I think we need to go home and check that our parents are okay, before we struggle to even see 2 feet in front of ourselves." "Yeah, I think..." Alex started. He was interrupted by the horrifying sound of metal coiling itself around something immovable, and we both snapped our necks around to see it. In the thick of the black downpour, a crumpled Prius. It had melded with the town sign in the center square, narrowly missing us. "That looks like Dad's car," Alex cried. I silently shivered on the spot, and it was a great shock to witness the mangled driver's side door creakily swinging open. There was the terrible sound of a misshapen metal grinding against misshapen metal. Other than the cacophony of rainfall, it seemed to be the only sound in the empty town center. Every smart soul had fled. From the wreckage, a bloody man fell onto grass caked in colorless sludge, and he supported himself with shaky arms. The dying light scarcely illuminated the figure, but the car, even as a distorted wreckage in the dark, was familiar. It looked like Alex's father. Moments before the world entirely plunged into darkness, we got a good look at his face, but it wasn't a view that answered our burning question. The only remaining feature was his mouth, and when the man parted his lips to scream, that mouth suddenly widened, splitting his head open like a raw egg. "Weak," he screeched in an inhuman wail. "Dad?" Alex whispered. The rain stopped. It had coated the road and lampposts in a stubbornly sludgy layer of unidentifiable horror. The sky was pitch black. Even the black bow was no longer visible. Pockets of light pierced the blackened, rain-smeared windows of houses. But Alex and I were well and truly in the dark, and all we could hear was the labored breathing of the thing that used to be his father. "We need to run," I whimpered in horror, seizing my friend's arm in a vice-like grip. I could could barely see the pavement in front of me, let alone the abomination from the car wreckage. But that was good. It meant he couldn't see us either. I hoped he couldn't see anything, given he only had a mouth. Then again, I could no longer be sure of anything. He was talking to me, Alex muttered. I ignored my friend, guiding him by the arm through the blackened streets. I was grateful for the darkness. It concealed the horrors that we could only hear. The black bow's early. Why is it so early? One man cried, slamming a car door. Move, he's behind us, a woman replied loudly. And further down the road, please, Lucy, please, another woman screamed. You'll hear me now, mother, a guttural voice shrieked. He's not my father, and he'll never be my father. The sound of screaming quickly gave way to squelching. My body started to tighten. A new type of fear gripped me. Something beyond primal horror. Whatever was happening, it was beyond anything a person should experience. He said that to me once. Alex continued. What? I asked, absent-mindedly scanning streets, trying to navigate a lightless world. He apologized, but he said men are supposed to be strong, and depression is a sign of weakness, Alex muttered, sniffling. But then he must have realized that he'd said too much, or Mum told him off. I don't know. He apologized, said I needed to see a shrink. I'm sorry, Alex, I said, guiding us down the road I was certain would lead to my parents' house. It's him, he whispered. Just from that word, weak, I knew it was him. Before I could respond, the sound of a scuffle ahead caused me to stop in my tracks, placing an arm in front of Alex. We could barely see one another, but I held a cautious finger up to my lips. Ronnie, please, a girl screamed. Anna. We could scarcely see them in the darkness, but there were two silhouettes in the middle of the road, and as the head of one figure seemed to separate down the middle, I felt a sickness in my gut. Why won't you just drink, bitch? The thing snarled. Ronnie, something's wrong with your... Please let me go. Anna whimpered. Girls, leading boys on. Say one thing, but mean another, the creature growled. As Alex and I cautiously waded through the black puddle to the other side of the street, I could faintly distinguish the thing prying open Anna's mouth with its fingers. She struggled and squirmed, likely trying to close her lips, but it was no use. I watched in fright as Ronnie shoveled black sludge from the road into her mouth. It'll stop hurting soon, he said in a soft growl. Thank you. That was all I wanted. Alex and I were sobbing as quietly as possible, and I was grateful, yet again, for the cloak of darkness, shielding us from the majority of the horror. But I still saw too much. Far too much. Anna was sobbing too, for half a minute or so, and then her sobs changed into laughter or mania. "I fucking hate you," she growled. Thankfully, at that moment, I reached a house with distinctive windows. The glass panes were coated in black rain, but given the light cast through the murkiness onto our front lawn, the shape of the house was familiar. It had to be my home. And when I bumped into the gate leading onto the front path, I was entirely certain. I let go of Alex's arm for a second. Only a second. "Son," a voice bellowed. I spun around, and I couldn't see Alex anymore. I could hear the faint sound of feet wading through the black puddle. "Alex," I hissed through gritted teeth, not wanting to ingest any fresh droplets of rain that might emerge. "Come on, my house is right." "Go, Charlie," he interrupted, whimpering. "Is that you, insect?" His father's voice roared from the far end of the street. "Crying again?" "I know this isn't you, Dad," Alex called. "It's this thing." "Keep your mouth closed, Alex," I hissed again. Anna giggled. "Nobody likes him at school." "He's always been weak, Mr. Harding," Ronnie chimed in. "The bow said so." "The bow never lies," Alex's father said. "It would make a real man of you, Alex. No more weakness." "Dad, I want to help you. If we just take you home," Alex said, wading farther away from me. "Home? This is our home." His father laughed. "Where's Mum?" Alex asked. I wanted to wade after him, but I was afraid. I didn't want to die. I knew, somehow, that Mr. Harding, Ronnie, and Anna could not be saved. But Alex, he didn't seem to care. Looking back, I can see that my friend was lost in whatever thoughts plagued him. So lost that he didn't notice reality disintegrating around him. And I suppose the black bow wanted him for that very reason. It feeds despair and cruelty into our minds. It fuels blackened thoughts that lie dormant in there. "In the garden," his father said. Alex cried, and I heard the sound of multiple footsteps wading ever closer. Meanwhile, I was quietly inching the gate open, and then the wading ceased. "Bye, Charlie," Alex whispered. A scuffle commenced, too darkened for me to distinguish, but I could hear Alex choking, much as Anna had. I knew that the bow would take him too. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys, crying inwardly as I heard Alex's cries subside. I thrust them into the lock, pushing the door open, as I turned to close it right behind me. The light from our front hallway illuminated the exterior of my house. Just beyond the gate, I could see them. Alex, Ronnie, Anna, and Mr. Harding, standing four abreast, heads transformed into ghoulish, wide-mouthed monstrosities. I slammed the door, locking it, and turning to see two fully faced, crying parents running towards me. I left that town long ago, as most do. My parents moved there in '87, so they had never seen nor heard of the Black Bow. And that's why I don't blame them for what had happened. We would later learn about the ominous black rainbow from the real estate agent who sold the house to us. A little old man named Arnold. A man who had fled town with others as the bow formed on that day in 2003. My father pinned him against a wall until he spilled all of his secrets. "Yes, I knew about it," he said. 83, 63, 43. It shows every 20 years. But you wouldn't have believed me. Nobody believes it until they see it for themselves. Yeah? Well, you could have not sold the house to us. My father screamed. This is my life, Mr. Carlson. My home. I have to make a living. And is the ugliness really that bad? It only lasts for 7 days, every 20 years. The rest of the time? This is the most beautiful town in the world. A slice of paradise by the sea. He said. Why would you stay here? Why would anyone? My father cried. Because we know not to drink it, he said. Just don't drink it, and everything will be okay. The storm passes. It always passes. But that answer always pains me. My father asked the right question. Why would some stay? Perhaps they've come to believe the bow's lies. Perhaps that place is doomed to repeat its cycle. And I know that any day now, the black rainbow will return. Our wedding group celebrated with an after-party at an Italian restaurant. Train tracks above the eatery caused the noise of the industrial wheels to thunder. The clattering could not even be muffled by the overhead violin music and thick walls. Anita and I were bridesmaids for the woman of the hour, our mutual close friend, Kate. Kate had decided to swear a lifetime of commitment to a professor of film studies at a university only a few miles outside the town, 2 years beforehand in July. Although he was a decade older than her, and his initial motives were naturally questioned by her family, he was in love with everything about Kate. The ceremony had been a peaceful one, with a lakefront view. The 100 of us were seated and awaited our food. The main foyer of the place became a dance floor, as a private bar opened up in the corner, near a window that overlooked a graveyard across the street. When are you going to find your soulmate? Anita asked as she leaned into me, while we watched the newlyweds cut their cake and hand-feed it to each other. Oh, please, I said with an eye roll. What? You don't think it's possible for you? Look at Kate. She swore off any attempt at romance after her first boyfriend in college went to that country club prison for embezzlement at his hedge fund. Cupid doesn't care about your perspective. He drunkenly shoots all the time, and you never know when one of his stray arrows will hit you in the heart. That's the corniest thing I've ever heard anyone say. It's true though. You deserve a man who will treat you the way you deserve. Please, drop it, I said, as I lifted a glass of red wine and took a long pull. After my last ex, I'm going to take a break from the nonsense of dating. He made me reconsider how much I trust my taste in men. No. I'm about to become a manager, and that's going to take a lot of my energy. My career is first and foremost right now. The director of marketing at my company is named Chris, Anita said with a smile. He's 30, so he's only a few years older than you. He makes $100,000 a year and keeps fit. I trust my intuition, and it tells me you and him would get along great. I could give you his phone number if you'd like. Anita, I said with an aggressive whisper, as there was a brief interlude between songs. Stop it. You won't convince me. Kate leaned back in her chair and nodded as the waiter set our plates down. Once dinner was finished, I looked at my timepiece. Nightfall was near. I congratulated Kate and said goodbye to both her and the groom. I fished my keys out of my purse and walked into the parking lot. A few others trickled out into the evening air and departed for the highway. I neared my Hyundai and used my fob to unlock it. A group of 4 men suddenly surrounded my vehicle. They all wore casual t-shirts and cargo shorts. 2 of them held expensive-looking cameras. A short one with a charcoal black mustache held a boom and had earmuff-style headphones on. One of the cameramen was filming the interior of my vehicle. This gave me chills. I was speechless and tried to figure out why they would focus on the interior of my mode of transportation. Could a wild animal have gotten inside somehow, and they were trying to capture the moment for their social media? Of course, this made no sense. Getting such footage wouldn't have required a full-fledged hired crew. What are you doing? I asked with a forceful tone. They all shifted their attention towards me. None of them even mouthed a single word in response. The tallest man took a few steps in my direction as he raised his camera and pointed it at me. A lump formed in the back of my throat. I had the urge to scream, but could not raise my voice, which had somehow been lost since the sight of them. The recordist tapped the cameraman on the shoulder and pointed to the road. The individual who I sensed wanted to get nearer to me turned around and directed the rest of the group to move away. They jumped into a silver van with a creaky sliding door. They drove away and left a trail of dust as they exited the lot. I searched around for surveillance cameras. There were none. Any potential witnesses had exited the vicinity or were nowhere in sight. I wanted to cry as I stood there in between a streetlight and a section of vacant yellow-lined parking spaces. I could not understand who they were or what they wanted. Could the men have been private investigators? I had not committed any crimes outside of a speeding ticket from 2 years before. Them having been undercover was a ridiculous notion for something so minor. But my mind was racing with possibilities. Paparazzi? I was not famous. I was not even related to or friends with someone who was. I neared the car and maintained an arm's length distance from it as I did a full circle. I stared at the front and back seats. Nothing was unusual, nor was anything taken. Perhaps they were an independent production shooting a low-budget movie. That kind of artistic activity was not uncommon in this area of Southern California. I calmed myself with some deep breaths, hopped onto the driver's side, and drove back home. I would try and forget the strange occurrence. Maybe you overreacted by assuming they had ill intent, I told myself. A week went by and Anita invited me to play tennis with her. The court we met at was located in between a public library and a fire station. Our bleach-white tank tops and skirts shone brightly under the sun's glare. I both loved and hated the game for how difficult it could be on a humid day. The rigorous exercise provided an outlet for escape and helped me temporarily forget about stress. "Let's make a bet," Anita said as she threw the ball in the air and caught it with the grace of a juggler. "If I win, you have to let me give you a psychic reading about your personal life. I get to describe to you who you might meet in the next 18 months using my intuition. If you win, then I buy you an expensive dinner at a seaside place in Malibu." "I respect your beliefs," I said. "But I told you, I don't want anything to do with witchcraft. It's non-localized consciousness that anyone can hone with the right meditative techniques," she said with a smirk, as though she had memorized the sentence from a spiritual lecture. It may have been the decent sleep within the prior 24 hours, or the energy boost from that morning's very strong espresso. But I said yes and agreed to the bet. I served. I hit the ball far enough to make her run after it. Her racket connected with the ball and sent it my way. Our match became competitive in a way that none of our previous games in 8 years of knowing each other ever had. We kept the game going to where I predicted a tiebreak was inevitable. Someone appeared in my periphery. I turned to my left to get a better glance at the stranger, and failed to return the shot. I had lost the game. The defeat was the least of my concerns. The same film crew I had seen 7 days ago stood there behind the chain-link fence that divided us. The one with the boom smiled at me as blood-red liquid dripped from the end of the microphone onto the hot pavement. A small stream of crimson flowed near his shoes. "I'll use the drinking fountain in the library, and we can have 5 more sets," Anita said as she jogged towards the front of the building after she whipped a towel over her shoulder. I motioned her to stop and stay with me, but she had already turned her back. I could not find my voice. I ran towards the access way and circled the court to get to the film crew. I reached into my gym bag at the edge of the court and retrieved a canister of mace I always tried to have at hand. I was already a bit slower than I would have liked from the intensive cardio before, as I sprinted at them. While I approached, one of them laughed and moved down the road towards the same silver van. It was parked in the shade of a valley oak tree. They hopped in with the same speed as a professional militia retreating from an assassination mission and accelerated up a nearby hill. They were out of sight. I gasped for air and went back onto the court. Anita walked towards me with a concerned look on her face, as she could tell something was wrong. "Did you see them?" I asked. "Who?" I described each creep down to the brand of footwear they had on, and she just shook her head. "I'm calling the cops," I said. A patrolman showed up less than half an hour later. He was no older than 22 and looked as though he was new to the force. His name tag read Jones. One thing about the officer's appearance caught me off guard. He had the same phony-looking charcoal mustache as the crew member who had been following me. "Can you turn your body camera off?" I asked. "I'm sick of people filming me against my will this week." "Sorry, ma'am," he said as he pulled out a notepad and pen. "No can do. It's on for your safety and mine." "Okay. There's a group of men stalking me." "Can you give me their descriptions?" I did, to the best of my recollection, and gave him the color and model of their getaway car. "Did you get a license plate number? Were there any identifiable bumper stickers or logos?" "No, I'm afraid not." "Did they say anything to you?" "No. They taunted me, though." "How?" "They smiled at me." "Okay. Have you met or known any of these individuals beforehand? Ex-boyfriends, maybe? Or guys who asked you out on dates that you may have rejected in the past?" "No," I said. A swelling of resentment formed in my chest. I did not like that he was trying to paint a picture in his report of me attracting bad company, as though it would have been my fault, even if I had known those probable lunatics. There was a tinge of potential victim blaming that made me nauseous and angry. I had already been with a guy who mistreated me almost a year beforehand, and a part of me wondered if this officer knew about the case. He had probably already ran my name after collecting my ID at the beginning of the field interview. "What kind of investigation can you do to help get these guys away from me?" One had a microphone soaked in blood. "Did you witness the men approach the tennis court?" The cop asked Anita after ignoring my question altogether. Anita shook her head. That was it. He likely would not even search the area, and I would be labeled a crazy person. My statement would be dismissed as overly emotional and dramatized if it was not judged as a hallucination. She missed it because she went into the library to get some water, I said as I tossed the racket onto the ground. "You have to believe me." "I'll give you a log number from our dispatch so you can reference it if you get more information and want to do a follow-up," he said as he ripped a page out from the notebook and handed it to me. "In the meanwhile, I'd recommend cooling down at home and getting some rest with your AC on high. People have been having heat strokes today." As we left, I searched the perimeter for red stains on the ground. Nothing was there. My place is a bungalow-style house I have lived in for over 6 years. I stepped in, shut the door behind me, and placed my gym bag and car keys on the table. I petted my American short-hair cat named German Otter as I passed by her on the way to my bedroom. She followed me down the small hallway and into the place where I slept as I flipped my entertainment system on and crawled into bed. She hopped up on the mattress and made herself comfortable as I put on a true crime program. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and gripped a bottle of strong melatonin. I looked at the alarm clock and saw it was only 6 p.m. I usually did not get any shut-eye until hours from now, but I contemplated taking 2 to pass out sooner. I yearned to eliminate the day from memory. I undid the cap and placed the tablets in my palm. I gazed at my water glass and saw it was empty. I let out a sigh of frustration as I grabbed it and went back into the kitchen. I took the pills and went to bed. I drifted off and hoped I would not come to until noon the next day. My phone caused me to snap back to wakefulness. An alarm had been triggered by my security app connected to the surveillance system of my home. I lifted the device and stared at it. Motion detected close by, the message read. I scrolled down and stared at the camera perched above my front door. The same film crew stood on the porch. The tallest one knocked. I could hear the rapping of his fists from my bedroom as I stood up and brought up the keypad on my screen to dial for help. I minimized the screen and continued to wait for the dispatcher's voice as I maximized the video display again. They were gone. The front of my domicile was now empty. The only things visible were the silhouettes of neighbors' houses in the distance and the row of parked cars along the curb. I searched for the silver van, and it was not there. I scrolled through the different feeds once more and could not see them on my property anywhere. I even rewound the footage, and it showed no trespassers at any point in time. They had vanished with so much speed that I wondered if I had fallen victim to an anxiety-induced reverie. I went back to the phone screen and found the call had been disconnected, as if they had hung up on me, or a technical error had prevented them from going through. German Otter sat on the windowsill and stared at me. The man with the boom was behind her, outside. The pole tapped the glass, and I recoiled off the bed as I anticipated him shattering the screen to try and come in. I hit the floor and grabbed a butcher knife under the mattress I always kept there to feel safer. I have never considered myself particularly brave, but flight over fight had also never been an option for me. My father always drove me to self-defense classes when I was a child, and I was taught to assume that those who invaded my personal space had to be treated as though they had the worst intentions. I looked at the end of the blade and considered whether or not my physical strength would carry enough momentum for the tip of the knife to pierce through the pain and right into his face, neck, or chest. I leaped towards the window and raised the blade. I knew to keep the weapon high and tight with the sharp end pointed towards the ceiling. The other free hand up the way a boxer maintains discipline with their shell or guard. He was not there anymore. I cracked the window open and took in the scent of the dewy grass since the neighbor's sprinklers had shut off moments ago. There were no shoeprint indentations on the lawn either. "Leave me alone," I said. "Why me?" Anita lived in an apartment complex downtown. I pulled into her private garage since she had managed to gift me a clicker for the underground parking years ago. I took the elevator to her floor and knocked. She answered in Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night pajamas. She was shocked to see me. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said as I walked in. Her place had statues of mythical figures at every corner. Everything from sculpted dragons made of black marble, and Greek monsters. The Minotaur and Medusa the most noticeable. I explained to her the events of the night before. She had me sit down on her couch and offered me chocolate, although I was too preoccupied mentally to think about eating. "Did you call the police?" "I tried, and then gave up. They never came back." "You should still report it." "Anita, this is going to sound crazy, but I think they're professionals. They came and went without leaving a trace. Whenever I see them, no one else seems to. I lose my voice every time they come near, and I can't explain why that even happens. I don't know their motive for targeting me." Anita sighed and leaned back as she took a long sip from a coffee mug. "I know you're agnostic," she said. "Fair enough. I can't tell you to believe what I do. Yet, I think you should let me do your psychic reading now." I did lose the bet, I said through gritted teeth. I was not that interested in fulfilling my end of the bargain. I already had a steady stream of feeling haunted by something, and I did not want her weird energy through whatever bizarre ritual she had planned to upset me further. Nevertheless, I had to be a person of my word. Anita walked towards her closet and pulled out a leather satchel. She placed it on the cushion between us and pulled the glass table that sat in front of the sofa closer towards us. She spread tea leaves on top of the surface. "Hold still and stay quiet," she said. "You don't have a crystal ball?" "You don't need one. Nobody does. We all have the gift of entering the Akash, the field of invisible knowledge. The only preferable setting is a quiet and undisturbed one." "Whatever you say." She shushed me, closed her eyes, held my hand and sat still for 15 minutes. Her eyelids eventually opened. "This is what the guardians in the other told me," she said. "Your ex has put a curse on you. He is using a team of conjured familiars to follow you everywhere you go. The purpose is to spy on, undermine, and harass you." I grew lightheaded and wanted to tell her that this was impossible, but every fiber of my being believed it. My ex had always bragged about checking out books on black magic from the time he was an adolescent. At the time, I merely considered this the behavior of a typical boy into heavy music and wearing eyeliner to punk rock shows. As her words sunk in, it did occur to me that he was the type to summon something like that. A part of me still wanted to argue with her. I yearned to tell her it was her own cognitive biases regarding her own deeply held convictions about ethereal subjects and having consumed too many viral online occultist methods. Instead, I responded with what I knew was the right way to do so. "How do I break his hex and get revenge?" I asked. We stood in the center of the graveyard across the street from the Italian restaurant at 2 in the morning. Anita held a mandrake, the rare and humanoid plant used in traditions of causing physical harm to others for centuries. Focus your intent on putting him in overwhelming amounts of pain, she said. I considered whether or not I could go through with this. Perhaps I could do the ceremony to appease my friend and make her feel as though she did a favor. I could avoid the guilt of controlling someone's fate by stating to myself that this was all futile gibberish. Anyway, a rite that would not have a genuine impact on reality. Still, I did as she instructed. Anita dug a ditch the size of a shoebox. She raised the mandrake in the air. Let him feel the momentum of flight, she said as she tossed the plant into the earth. She covered it and burnt incense that smelled of hazel. We went back to her place, and Anita was energized. I was quiet and tried to remind myself that this was likely nothing, a funny tale we would share later on. The next day, Anita sent me a message. An article was attached. Man died in car accident early this morning. The headline read. I felt my stomach turn. I had killed someone. Even if I could not be prosecuted for it in any sensible court. I contemplated asking her if we could reverse it, and if there was anything to be done that could counteract the feeling of being a murderer. What he had done was torment me, sure, but he did not enact a preternatural death on me. I printed the article out and hung it on my bathroom mirror as a reminder. Remorse soon turned to rage. He left me with no other choice, since he could not leave me alone. I have not seen the documentary crew since. I have nightmares of silver vans to this day. "5 years ago, my wife gave birth to our youngest child, Toby. We had already had a son and a daughter beforehand, and we all lived in a large 2-story house, in a cozy little neighborhood, so space was never a problem for us. Eventually, when Toby started potty training, my wife and I told him to knock on the bathroom door to see if anyone else was in there for common courtesy. Over time, Toby developed a strange little habit. Whenever someone would knock on the bathroom door, and if he was nearby, he would either say, "Somebody's in there," if someone was in the bathroom, or "Nobody's in there," if nobody was in the bathroom. Now, his siblings found this little quirk annoying at times, but I paid it no heed. At the near end of November, after Thanksgiving, my wife and I wanted to decorate for Christmas. We were planning on buying new decorations, but we had some old Christmas lights somewhere in the basement that we wanted to use. On a Thursday night, my wife took our daughter to the salon, while our eldest son was in a study group at the library. So it was just me and Toby in the house. After reviewing our taxes from the last year, I decided to go to the basement to get the Christmas lights, so I can set them up before the weather turns worse for wear. I went downstairs to the first floor and crossed the living room from where Toby was sitting on the couch, watching his favorite cartoon show, while absent-mindedly eating a bag of Teddy Grahams. I reached the basement door, and as my hand grasped the doorknob, Toby said, "Somebody's in there." I paused as a slight jolt of shock passed over me. Confusion soon followed as the bathroom was on the other side of the living room, and Toby was still on the couch, watching TV. "What did you say, son?" I asked, turning to him. Toby didn't take his eyes off the television when he responded. "Somebody's in there." "In the bathroom?" "No, in the basement," he clarified. Fear ebbed its way into my psyche, which I tried to brush off. "Who's in the basement?" Toby shrugged and grabbed another handful of Teddy Grahams. I turned to the door, my hand still holding the doorknob. I stood there, as if waiting for someone to walk up the stairs and open the door from the other side. Memories resurfaced of my childhood. Irrational fear of the dark, hiding from the boogeyman from my closet. Reading Stephen King and different horror stories of all flavors. The basement of my old house, filled with cobwebs and old antiques that were decades old. How I would hear things down there scurrying, lurking, waiting to jump out at me. For a moment, I thought of waiting till tomorrow during the day to get the Christmas lights. Or better yet, have my eldest go get them for me. I immediately shook my head. This is ridiculous, I thought. There's no one in the basement. Toby is 5 years old. Children make these things up all the time. It's what they do. I was in the basement a week ago, and I've been here all day. Nobody is in there. Defiantly, I opened the basement door. The staircase led to a landing where the stairs continue to the right. The sides of the stairs are walled off, so the basement wasn't visible. I then flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. I re-flipped the light switch, and the lights still wouldn't turn on. I could have sworn I changed the bulbs a month or so ago. Determined to not let my childhood fears get the best of me, I went to the kitchen and fished out a flashlight. After checking if the batteries still worked, I ventured downstairs and stopped on the landing. The light from the living room spilled only to the landing, leaving the rest of the basement unnaturally dark. I turned on the flashlight and slowly traversed down the increasingly creaking stairs. Our basement was a cluttered maze of stacked boxes, old furniture, and other forgotten antiques. I searched my mind and vaguely remembered the lights being in a box in the far corner of the room. I maneuvered my way through the clutter, careful not to knock anything over. My ears were perked, listening to the abstract silence. As I was halfway through, my nerves were on end. I kept looking at the corner of my eye, ensuring that the shadow next to me was mine alone. I steadied my breathing through my nose to minimize any noise I made. Suddenly, I kicked a nightstand, knocking the lamp on top over. I grabbed it before it hit the ground. The wobble of the nightstand was deafening, as well as the silence soon after. Placing the lamp on the table, I continued my search. Fear started to overtake me. I could feel my fight or flight senses go haywire, telling me to turn and leave. My courage draining as I actively had to push my reluctant, shaking body forward. I thought I felt my heart stop when I shined my light on a figure in front of me. I backed up into a stacked pile of boxes as my mind was failing to process the terror before my eyes. It had no face. Its body was covered in wild fur. Its arms were outstretched towards me. My toes were curled, ready to run. But then I realized it was a mannequin, wearing a brown fur coat, fuzzy pink scarf, and a feathered hat. I exhale, hoping the fear would leave with my breath. I felt emotionally exhausted as I passed by the mannequin, and my eyes set on the Christmas lights hanging on top of stacked boxes. I snatched the lights, pulling them out rather haphazardly. As I started to wrap the lights around my arm, I heard a crash. I turned back immediately, shining the light on the mannequin, which was now facing me. Next to it, 3 boxes lay on the floor, its contents spilling out. At first, I questioned how the mannequin turned towards me, but decided to shrug it off, figuring the falling boxes caused it to turn. Or did it cause the boxes to fall? A random thought popped into my head. I shook it off and made my way past the boxes, not bothering to clean up the mess. As I did, I shrank from the mannequin's outstretched hands, fearing to even let them graze me. I hastened my pace rather quickly this time, not bothering to be careful as I bumped into several things with little regard. Behind, I heard crashes as things fell over, followed by a light tapping sound. I rushed further as I realized it sounded like footsteps other than my own. I dared not to look back, not wanting to confirm what my mind was conjuring, not wanting to see that stiff form moving towards me. As the footsteps came closer, I started to sprint, jumping over the old couch and knocking over boxes without any care. I made it to the stairs and hopped 2 or 3 steps at a time. As I made it to the landing and turned to run up the second staircase, I saw a glimpse of my pursuer. The mannequin was crawling on the stairs after me. Its once stiff hands were now open with jagged ends. Its faceless head stared right at me. I dashed upwards, hand on the railing, which I was grateful for, as I slipped on a stair but managed to catch myself. As I continued my run, I felt its jagged fingers narrowly grasping my pants leg. I made it to the top, and as I turned to see the monstrous creature lunging from the stairs towards me, I slammed the door, hearing, to my satisfaction, it crashing down the stairs, breaking and snapping apart. I leaned against the door, slowly sliding down. I sat on the ground, covered in sweat, my necktie askew, my glasses hanging on one ear. The Christmas lights forgottenly wrapped on my arm. Toby turned to look at me, his expression rather calm. "Told you someone was in there." When Jeffrey was born, Maya had been in labor for 21 hours. We did a home birth, and I delivered. I hadn't done it before, Jeffrey being our first. Maya insisted we give the fully natural birth thing a go. We had consulted midwives. I'd taken a course and read many books. Our contingency plan was jumping in our Jeep and driving the 8 minutes to Evergreen Hospital if anything went wrong. A lot seemed to go wrong, and it was a hellish 21 hours. I wanted to go to the hospital after the first hour. Maya was in such discomfort, but she insisted. Stubborn woman. I felt the decision to press on, made again and again over the course of her labor, was dangerous, stubborn. Ultimately, she crowned and things went quickly. Jeffrey slipped out as if there had not been 20 hours of labor. I was at first elated, but then shocked. Jeffrey came out facing down, and when I rotated him with the intention of cradling my boy, I found his eyes already open, expressionless, but staring me dead in the face. No crying whatsoever, while his eyes, a bright, fresh mint color, bore into me as if filled with consciousness. I was ashamed to admit it back then, but I can say now that it was like staring into the face of a psychopath. There was no emotion or empathy in those eyes. It was as if I was being consumed by them, as if I were merely prey to this brand new baby. I never told Maya. He shut his eyes again before I handed him to her, and from then on, it was baby as usual, blinking eyes open, looking around, crying. Fast forward 2 years, Maya gave birth to our second child, baby Zoe, 3 months ago. Nothing out of the ordinary. We did a hospital birth this time, and the labor was almost non-existent. Zoe cried. Her eyes were closed. As I'd looked at her, I remembered Jeffrey's death stare at birth, and quickly handed new Zoe to Maya, when a shiver of memory shot through my body, and I felt weak. But that's not why I find myself recording this today. In the time since we brought Zoe home, things have spiraled out of control. It began right when we got back from the hospital. The babysitter left, and Maya knelt down and in her mummy voice presented Zoe to Jeffrey as he stood in the hall. I stood above Maya, watching. Jeffrey's head didn't move as he looked at Zoe, but suddenly his eyes in their sockets moved so quickly that I staggered slightly when they caught me in their stare. The same psychotic expression from his birth, and the first I'd seen it since. Maya must not have noticed, because she was still cooing at Zoe, and before she could notice, Jeffrey had broken the icy hold his mint eyes had on me, and he was back to being curious toddler for Maya. I couldn't bring myself to talk to Maya about this. I guess at first I thought it was a fluke incident. Maya and I have no other secrets, but something in me wanted to spare her from these moments where I feel my son is not all there. The meeting of the children was the first incident, but it was nothing compared to the second and most recent. Maya was asleep. The babies too. Or so I thought. I had just finished a bit of work and had closed my laptop, taken a final sip of my port nightcap. Our house is a single story with a sunken living room. Jeffrey learned how to tumble down the single stair onto the carpet at first, but now he could walk a clumsy baby walk to descend it. I don't know how he managed this, but I found him in the middle of the living room, having brought his sister somehow from her crib. Zoe lay before him, and he stood there like a man, staring down at her. When he noticed me, the shock of the scene and his eyes alone held me in a fearful grasp, so I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. His eyes were so intense and didn't break their lock on mine. In this state, he knelt down as his little 2-year-old body had the experience of decades. Slowly, with methodical precision, his little paw of a hand went to clasp little Zoe's mouth. And in that moment, I could feel a scream wanting to burst from my throat. But it was hampered by Jeffrey's repressive effect on me. My mouth opened, but, like trying to scream in a nightmare, only suppressed air came forth. Just then, a light flooded the room, and before I could register a change, it had already occurred. The babies were both flailing and crying on the carpet, red with tears and faded breath, while Maya rushed forward in her nightgown, screaming at me and cursing, demanded to know what I was doing. I don't know, Maya. What do you mean you don't know? What is going on? She screamed. I was helplessly motioning toward them, while she angrily held me at bay with her hand, simultaneously scooping up the children in one arm. Adrenaline pumped into me, and I could hear my blood flow. "It's Jeffrey," I yelled without thinking. "What the fuck?" She screamed, blood red in the face, all the late 30s wrinkles creasing in anger. I mean, I stammered. These are my children," she yelled. I lay on the couch after she retreated back to our room with the babies. I lay there, listening to the wailing and the cooing, and the eventual softening and silence. I lay there wide awake, but instead of thinking of my blunder, whether it was mentioning Jeffrey or having not mentioned him sooner at some more opportune moment, I was thinking of his eyes and his movement, the way he seemed to inhabit his little body with the control of an adult. More than that, he moved with the kind of precision that's normally choreographed. Slow, methodical, surgical, deliberate, all while restraining his captive with that psychotic stare. I couldn't sleep. I could barely blink. I lay there in the brightly lit living room until sunlight flowed in. Then I left. Took the Jeep out on a drive. I lost track of time because it was already 4 p.m. when I felt my phone vibrate. Unknown number. I picked it up out of habit. "Hello," I said. "Is this Mr. Helmuth?" "Yes. Who is speaking, please?" "This is Evergreen Hospital. We need you to come in right away." What's the problem?" I said. "Your wife is in a coma, Mr. Helmuth. Please, come in." The words lingered like a buzzing in my ear. What? At the hospital, I found Maya's mother pacing in front of her bed. When she saw me, she shot over and slapped me in the face. "Where were you?" she snapped. I was bewildered. What had happened? Who found her? How did they find her? I had no missed calls. Why is Maya's mother here before me? I was driving," I said, clueless. Maya lay in the bed unconscious, hooked up to a machine that beeped and whirred. Just then a nurse entered, looked at Maya's mum, and then at me. "Are you the father?" she said. I looked down and she was holding Jeffrey's little hand. He was sucking his thumb, staring straight ahead. I began. Fear surged through me as I looked down at the top of Jeffrey's head. Messy brown hair, sucking noises. "Where's Zoe?" demanded Maya's mother. "Who?" said the nurse. The sucking noises stopped, and Jeffrey's head craned unnaturally to look up at me. Expressionless. Deep mint eyes looking at me. My pulse increased. "My granddaughter." "Ma'am, there was only this boy with the woman." I heard the door open again, rustling feet, metal clanging. "Sir, could you come with us, please? We have some questions," said the man's voice. That's the last I remember. I think I blacked out. I'm under investigation as a suspect in a crime that no one can say what happened. Maya's in the hospital. Her mum is still there. They've searched the house, but had to put an APB out about Zoe. My daughter is still missing. I'm back home now. I couldn't bring myself to tell them everything. The door's closed because Jeffrey is here. I know I'll have to go out there eventually. But it's him. I swear to God, it's him. My hometown of Cedar Creek, Colorado, had a woman who everyone loved to hate. Her name was Mrs. Gatlin, and she was both my elementary school's janitor and the scapegoat for all unfortunate events around our town. The Cedar Creek elderly despised her for having a son out of wedlock, and the town parents scorned her for giving said son too much freedom. A parenting style which had supposedly led to his death at the hands of our town's eponymous river. As for the children of Cedar Creek, we didn't care at all about social conventions or parental negligence. But we all agreed that Mrs. Gatlin was an ugly lady, and that was enough to warrant our cruelty. My best friend at the time was a curly-haired menace to society named Isaac, who, by 5th grade, had established himself as a ringleader amongst the neighborhood boys. He did his best to inconvenience Miss Gatlin, though his pranks did little to rattle her. If we spread rumors about her poor hygiene just within her earshot, Miss Gatlin didn't even bat an eye. If we released bugs inside of her janitorial closet, she'd calmly sweep them outside. If we stuffed rotten food inside her locker, she'd clean it out quietly and without complaint. Our usual tricks never worked on Miss Gatlin, and all of us unimaginative kids were stumped by how to best a woman whose job was to clean up messes of all kinds. In my last year of primary school, Hanukkah fell a week and a half before we were dismissed for winter break. All of the Jewish children thoroughly enjoyed showing off their gifts to the rest of us, who had to wait an eternity for our presents. Thanks to Kim Possible, Spy Kids, and Totally Spies, every kid in Cedar Creek was obsessed with espionage. So, Isaac's gift of a spy tech kit for kids made him even more popular than usual. Most of the kit was cheap plastic junk, but there was a small spy radio that seemed very well manufactured. It consisted of an earpiece and a button-sized microphone that was supposedly capable of transmitting audio up to a radius of 5 miles. Isaac, myself, and the rest of our crew spent most of the week before winter break running around town and testing the capabilities of the device. The audio quality was surprisingly good, although the earpiece and microphone could only be separated for about 3 miles before the sounds became too distorted to understand. It was a novel concept for a few days, but after a while, we grew bored of playing walkie-talkie. Isaac wanted to use it for its intended purpose, surveillance, and he had the perfect target in mind. On the last day before winter break, Isaac and I glued the button-sized device to the back of an old brooch we had found in his sister's jewelry box. We covered it up with a strip of velvet, and then glued on the pin and catch. And by the time we were done, you couldn't tell anything was amiss. We put it in a small white box, which we put in my backpack for later. We determined that I should be the one to deliver it, given Isaac's reputation as a prankster. After school, I found Miss Gatlin in the staff break room. She barely looked at me as I walked into the room. I noticed, along the far wall of the break room, a wall of cubbies, each one marked with the name of a staff member. All of them were filled with gifts and letters, presumably from parents or other employees at the school. All of them, that is, except one. "You can't be in here, kid," Miss Gatlin said to me in her gruff voice. "I know." I swung my backpack onto my stomach and fished around for the box. It had gotten a little banged up in my bag, but I figured she wouldn't really care. I procured it and held it out to her. "But I wanted to give you this before the break." She stopped packing up, turning fully toward me. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring suspiciously at the box. Setting her bag down, she took a few steps forward and grabbed the box out of my hand. She gave it a slight rattle, and then opened it slowly. When she saw the brooch, she gingerly took it out of the box and turned it around in her hand. Then she paused again, looking between the glittering, fake emerald and me. "It's not new. Sorry. It used to be my mum's," I told her, going off of the script Isaac and I had conceived to add more authenticity to the handoff. "She doesn't wear it anymore, but I thought you might like it." Miss Gatlin kept staring at me, her expression unreadable. I half expected her to chuck it into the garbage bin in the corner of the room. But to my relief, she gave me a single nod. "Thank you," she said, and pinned the brooch onto her cardigan carefully, like it was a precious gem and not some cheap hunk of plastic. I gave her a smile that she did not return, and then she shooed me away. Isaac was waiting for me in the woods outside school. I flashed him a thumbs up, and he slapped my back twice in congratulations. He pulled the earpiece out of his backpack and held it between us. I put my ear next to the speaker and was delighted when I could hear movement. The sound was slightly more muffled now by the velvet backing, but the audio quality was still really good. We heard the sound of snow crunching under Miss Gatlin's feet as she walked herself through the woods home. We listened giddily for a few minutes, then raced back to my house to celebrate our success with hot chocolate. Since we had the attention span of two 10-year-old boys, we forgot about our triumph until just a few minutes before Isaac's mum came to pick him up. When I remembered, I pulled out the earpiece, which we had decided would live at my house, since it was closer to Miss Gatlin's, and listened. "More than last year, but not as much as the year before last. What do you think about it? Do you like it? Can you feel it?" I see. Me personally, I loved it since I was a little girl. It falls so prettily." "What the heck is she saying?" Isaac asked me, as if I had any clue. The better question, in my mind at least, was who the heck was she talking to? She had no kids or husband, and didn't have any friends as far as I knew. "I dunno," I said. "She's talking about snow, I think." Though the question, "Can you feel it?" seemed an odd thing to ask anyone. We sat there listening to her talk for 5 minutes straight. I'd never heard Miss Gatlin talk that much in my life, even though I'd seen her most days since I was only 5 years old. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure what we had expected, but it certainly wasn't a monologue of that length. We strained our ears listening for another voice, but heard nothing. "Maybe she's schizophrensic," Isaac volunteered. I had no idea what that was, but I trusted his authority. His mum showed up to take him home, and I turned the speaker off to walk him outside. After that, every once in a while, I would turn the speaker on and listen. It seemed that, no matter the time, be it early in the morning or late at night, Miss Gatlin was always talking. She talked about all kinds of things, everything from clothing to stocks, to the weather, to politics. Sometimes she prayed, talking so quickly and quietly that I could only make out 1 out of every 5 or so words. She apologized often, and spoke constantly of a promise. Sometimes when I turned on the speaker, all I heard were sobs. And sometimes the conversations were so strange that I couldn't make heads or tails of them.
"A young woman smiled at me today at the grocery market. Isn't that just the sweetest thing? I felt like it's been so long since someone smiled at me like that. Yes, I know she was just doing her job. Probably doesn't even know my name. Oh, how hard this has been. How lonesome. But I am so very close to the finish line. I won't break my promise now."
A few days before we returned to school, Isaac and I made the trek over to her house in an attempt to figure out who she was speaking to. I had seen her house a few times before, and each time I was taken aback by how small it was. Isolated and weathered, her home stood at the edge of the southern woodlands on a large plot of land, off of a street with very little through traffic. I remember standing on the side of the road with Isaac, staring at the shack-like house, which must have only had room for a bedroom, a bathroom, and maybe a tiny kitchen.
"There's no way anyone else lives there,"
Isaac said after a while of standing and staring. We were too far away to peer in through the windows, but we were also too afraid to venture any closer.
"She's either a witch, or she's just some sad, ugly old lady who went crazy from having no friends."
Isaac got bored quickly, so we left not too long after that. After we had made our way part way down the street, something compelled me to turn around and give the house one final look. When I did, I saw the unmistakable shape of Miss Gatlin standing on the porch, staring in our direction. I turned away and grabbed a hold of Isaac's arm. "She's watching us," I whispered to him. His eyes grew wide.
"Shit,"
he said.
"Should we run?"
No. That would look suspicious. Let's just keep walking." We walked until we were out of eyeshot, and then we ran all the way home. I'm not quite sure what spooked us so badly, but for some reason, even when I was back in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes burrowing into my back.
"And soon they'll all be coming back. It's hard seeing them sometimes, knowing my Oliver was among them once. Sometimes I think I see him. At least it'll get easier soon. Thanks to you."
By the time we went back to school, my friends had grown bored of the spy gear. I volunteered to return Isaac's speaker, but he said it was practically useless now, since we couldn't retrieve the microphone. Surprisingly, Miss Gatlin continued to wear the brooch every day. It was always pinned to her non-work clothes, so the only time she was unbugged, as Isaac put it, was when she was in her janitorial outfit at my school. Seeing her guard the brooch so carefully made me feel kind of bad. Was that the only gift she had gotten for Christmas? Was it the only gift she had gotten in the past decade? Maybe she wasn't a witch, or crazy. Maybe she was just lonely, and had learned to cope by talking to herself. Months passed. Isaac and company finally coming to terms with the fact that they would never get the rise they were looking for out of Miss Gatlin, moved on to terrorizing a curmudgeonly old man who lived across from Cedar Creek Elementary and was always yelling at kids for one reason or another. I was happy for Miss Gatlin. One day, in March, I found her sitting on a bench at the edge of campus during lunch. I took a seat next to her, not expecting much. She took one look at me, then fixed her gaze back at the sad-looking sandwich in her hand. "What do you want?" she asked without looking at me. Nothing. Just wanted to sit here." She picked at the sandwich. "We're not friends, kid." "I know. You don't have any friends." That's right." She nodded. "Maybe one day, though," I said, and to my surprise, she laughed. I didn't even realize she was capable of laughing. She looked at me properly for the first time in our brief conversation, and I noticed that she was smiling. It was an unpracticed smile, but a genuine one. "Yeah," she said. "Maybe one day." Miss Gatlin packed up and headed back to the school building after that. She left a bag of mini Oreos on the bench next to me. I think she did it on purpose. I grew accustomed to checking up on her every now and then, listening to her conversations with herself. Sometimes it almost felt like she was talking to me. Looking back on it now, I realize what a little villain I was, and what an immense invasion of privacy I was committing. I wish that I could take it back now, especially considering what happened next. Friday, May 17th, marked the 10-year anniversary of Oliver Gatlin's death. I kept an eye on Miss Gatlin throughout the day, but she didn't seem any more dejected than usual. Maybe things were finally looking up for her. In any case, although I hadn't checked in on her in a while, I decided that evening to see how she was doing. My parents were gone for the weekend, and I was only allowed to stay at home alone if I stayed inside the whole time. So, I had nothing better to do. Not long after sunset, as I lounged on the floor of my bedroom, I turned on the earpiece. Miss Gatlin was talking to herself, as always. But there was something strange about her tone. She sounded more excited than ever. "Almost there, almost there, almost there." She repeated those two words over and over, until At exactly 8:47 p.m., she let out a sound that I only understood years later to be a cry of triumph.
"It is done. It is done, Dark Angel. Thank you. Thank you. 10 years of solitude, and it was worth every second. Now, Angel, bring him back. Bring him back to me."
What was she on about now? Were those song lyrics or something? I strained my ears, listening for another person out of habit. But, of course, there was only Miss Kaplan's voice. After a moment, her cries of happiness faded, her voice taking on a confused tone.
"What do you mean?" "No, that can't be true. I kept my promise. I followed every rule. I let no one in, kept no companions, made no friends. I kept my wish a secret, as you told me. My angel, I sat up slowly, the building terror in her voice putting me on the edge, even from miles away. And then she asked a question that still haunts me to this day. "What do you mean? I had an audience."
There was a moment of silence, and then the surefire sound of the velvet backing of the brooch being ripped away. I could hear her breath, sharper and clearer than ever before, as she repeated a single word. "No, no, 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 no." She withdrew from the microphone, her rapid breaths replaced by what sounded like her front door being thrown open with a bang. There was no more noise from the microphone. I remember standing up in my bedroom, not quite understanding what had just happened, and not quite knowing what to do next. Something told me that I should go downstairs and make sure that the doors were locked. So I told myself to man up, and forced myself down the stairs to the dark first floor. I made my way around the whole house, checking the doors and windows. Once I was done, I just stood there. Somehow I knew she was coming, and that there was nothing I could do to stop it. I thought I was hearing the wind, but as it grew louder, I realized I was hearing wailing. I heard it long before I saw her. The gut-wrenching cry, that sound that I had previously heard only a pale imitation of in movies, where a mother loses her child. Standing in the darkness of my living room, I watched her sprint from the tree line towards my house. Her mouth was wide open, her eyes glazed over, and her body dressed in a white nightgown. She looked and sounded like something out of my worst night terrors. I dropped to the floor and crawled away from the window, taking cover behind a couch.
"Why?"
she howled, her mournful voice rising and falling as she ascended the steps to my front porch and slammed her fist against the door.
"Why? Why?"
I needed to get to the phone, but the house phone was right next to the window, and I was petrified. She hit the door so hard, I was afraid the hinges would give way.
"How could you do this to me?"
I clamped a hand over my mouth. She couldn't possibly know for certain that I was in the house, could she? The origin of the wailing shifted as she rounded the wraparound porch, the heavy knocks of her fist against the door giving way to the thudding of her shoes on the wooden porch floor. I stuck my head around the couch and saw no one at the front window. But when I looked to the side window, I saw a face hovering inches from the glass. I screamed at the top of my lungs as her fist came into contact with the glass, shattering it. I was so horrified by the rain of blood-speckled glass that I almost missed the sight of a shotgun scabbard strapped to her torso. Certain I was about to die, I screamed at her to go away, to leave me alone. And she screamed right back at me, asking me questions that I didn't understand. Dogs had begun to bark at the commotion, and my next-door neighbor's porch light had turned on. "Please just go away," I shrieked, as I finally found my footing and raced to the phone. I grabbed it from its holder, starting to type 911, as I decided whether or not I should risk running to the neighbor's house. When I looked at the broken window, though, she was nowhere to be seen. The wailing had rescinded, growing fainter and fainter, until I couldn't hear her at all. I stood there, dumbly, until the sound faded entirely, my hand shaking. She was gone. I was sure of it. Should I still call emergency services? After a moment, I heard another, fainter sound, and recognized the staticky audio immediately as a transmission from Isaac's spy gear. I raced upstairs, still clutching the phone, and grabbed the speaker from the floor where I had dropped it. I pressed it against my ear, listening to the faint sound of a familiar voice.
"I hope this was worth it, kid,"
it said, calmly and coldly.
"I hope you and your friends can laugh about this."
I heard a bang, and then I heard nothing at all. It took 2 weeks for the police to find her body. Her final resting place was deep in the woods, under a thick shroud of junipers, not far from the banks of Cedar Creek. As her face was mutilated beyond recognition, her body was identified by the shotgun lying beside her. They say that, although she was covered in enough blood to entice every animal within a 3-mile radius, her corpse was untouched by the beasts. Even the insects seemed hesitant to feed, and the fungi slow to grow upon her body, as though even the lowliest creatures feared contamination by the lonely woman in the woods. They did not find a brooch on her person. That Christmas Eve, I was excited to visit my new boyfriend, Jack's parents. I had grown attached to Jack in the few months we had been dating, and his parents, whom I had met once before, seemed gentle, kind, somewhat sad from the tragedy of losing their other child. a daughter, a few years ago, to cancer. But perhaps I only thought this because Jack had mentioned his deceased sister a few times in passing. Jack had bought me a new dress for Christmas. Odd, I thought. But then, perhaps I had watched Vertigo too many times and saw too much about gender and feminism online. It was beautiful, with an unusual dark green and red pattern, which perfectly brought out the highlights of my chestnut hair. Jack's eyes lit up when he saw me twirling around in it, and he said he couldn't wait for his parents to see me. We entered their suburban home, and Jack helped me take off my winter coat, while his parents made polite noises at us, which were cut short when they laid their eyes on me. His mother's eyes welled up, and she clasped her hand to her mouth. She left the hallway. I looked up at Jack. He was smiling. "Mum?" he called. His father frowned, but then remembered his manners and turned to me. "Come inside, my dear. You should have a drink now that you're here. Did Jack never tell you?" His voice trailed off. I followed his dad into the brightly lit living room, and suddenly I understood. For hanging on the wall was a full-length photo portrait of a young woman with Jack's features and rich chestnut hair, wearing the same beautiful red and green dress I had on. I turned to Jack angrily. How could he play such a mean trick on us? On me? On his parents? But when I saw his face, my anger turned to fear at the fixed look he was wearing. He came up to me and took my hands, looking deeply in my eyes. "Please, sweetheart, don't be mad," he beseeched. "They're always so sad at Christmas, always going on and on about Lucy. She was their favorite, you know. I thought you might cheer them up." His grip tightened, and the feelings of fear and confusion deepened. I looked at his parents helplessly. They were seated on the couch, his father's arms around his mother's slumping shoulders, while she dabbed at her eyes. They looked so frail and ill. What were they thinking? "Please, darling, let's just have dinner. They prepared a real feast for us. All the things you like. Just for a couple of hours," murmured Jack. Was it social conditioning? Was it survival? My skin crawling. I dumbly nodded. Jack turned to his parents. "Mum, Dad, we're starving. Is dinner ready?" he said brightly. His mum got up, visibly pulling herself together. We have nibbles in here. Where are your manners, John? Offer them drinks." She scolded her husband. Jack's dad turned to me. "What would you like, my dear?" Drinks in hand, the atmosphere relaxed, and Jack started chatting. "I love the photos you put up, Mum. Where did you even find these? This is our last ski trip together, right?
Lucy was such a champ. Do you remember when...
He turned to me mid-flow.
Dad won medals in skiing, you know. State championships. And Lucy took right after him.
His father beamed, and their last vestiges of courtesy towards me gave way to their obvious desire to talk about their daughter. They reminisced enthusiastically about their family vacations, gesturing to what seemed like the hundreds of photos, all glinting silver and gilt frames on the walls.
Of course, I could never ski like her,
I heard Jack say. He carried on.
Lucy baked with Mum.
Oh, Jack, are you still not over that? His mum responded almost playfully. My phone vibrated as they talked. Discreetly, I pulled it out, thanking God that Lucy had the good sense to wear a dress with pockets. A single word from an unknown sender. Leave.
Who is it, darling?
Called Jack, looking over his shoulder, interrupting himself in a deep analysis of whether he or Lucy were more popular in high school. I shook my head. It must be spam, I said, lightly, smiling at his mum. I looked at the photo over her head, and it was of Lucy, doing some kind of school presentation. She looked directly at me. I felt slightly dizzy. The wine, the PowerPoint slide in the photo shimmered, and the word was clear. Leave. Lucy seemed to nod. The voices rose and swirled around me.
I need to use the bathroom,
I said. Jack's mum showed me to the guest bathroom, thankfully next to the front door. I went in, and as soon as she left, I slipped out and opened the door. Are you leaving us? Jack's father was at the other end of the hallway, looking straight at me. I stared back, opening and closing my mouth. Suddenly, there was a huge crash from inside the living room. Glimpsing through, I could see that the full-length photo of Lucy in the dress had fallen to the floor. Distracted, Jack's father turned around, and I heard the startled cries of Jack and his mum. I didn't wait any longer. Grabbing my coat, I fled into the night. My best friend is quite literally perfect. He has the perfect face, the perfect personality, and he gets straight A's in every subject. Girls flock to him left and right. Sometimes I find myself staring at him, wondering how somebody could have no flaws. But I won't be able to see him the same ever again. A few days ago, he invited me to hang out at his house after school. I was quite excited, since we normally hang out at the library or my house. So, of course, I said yes. His house was within walking distance from our school, so it didn't take long for us to get there. When we arrived at his house, I was astonished. It was a beautiful, modern house, which was massive. I was always used to seeing small, run-down houses in our town, so seeing this was quite a shock to me. "Well, this is my house," he said, smiling at me as I looked at his house in awe. "It's nothing special." I've never seen anything like this before. I'm quite scared to go inside. I don't want to damage anything, I said, waiting behind him as he unlocked the door. The inside was as beautiful as the outside. It was spotless. Everything was perfect. At that point, I honestly wished I was him. He gave me a tour of the house, and after we sat down on the couch and watched some random Netflix series of people cooking. At some point, he paused the show. Hey, I need to do something. I'll be right back, okay?" he said with a sense of urgency. He was smiling at me, but I could tell something was wrong. Before I could reply, he dashed up the stairs, and after that, I didn't hear anything. I was expecting to hear the slam of a door or something, but I didn't. I was left sitting on his couch, confused, with a bunch of different questions whizzing around in my head. I sat there, patiently, waiting for him to come back. I waited, and waited. I checked the time. It had been around an hour. I was getting concerned now, so I decided to go and look for him. I wish I hadn't. When I finished walking up the lengthy staircase, my head began to hurt. There were so many different doors, so how would I know which one he was in? I don't remember seeing this many rooms from the time he gave me a tour of the house. I decided to open each one. The majority of them were bedrooms, but one was just empty. An empty white room. When I entered the room, the door behind me shut by itself. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was the wind. I decided to ignore it, and I realized there was another door in front of me. I opened it. The door behind me shut by itself. At this point, I didn't think it was a coincidence. Once again, there was a door in front of me. I opened it, and this time, I was met with a dimly lit room with no windows. The door behind me didn't shut this time. This room was extremely cold. It felt like I was in a freezer. There was a door in front of me, but this time it was slightly open. I decided to peek into the room. I saw a grotesque thing with rotting flesh. It looked like a human being with no skin, just muscle. But it was shaped weirdly, very weirdly. It was washing the skin of a human. There were no bones, no muscles, just skin and hair. It was the same color as my best friend's hair. It was making gnarly noises while violently scrubbing the skin with a weird type of cloth. I saw different products set aside on the sink. Glue, an unusual purple substance, which is what I'm guessing was used to wash the skin, and a weird glowy thing in a spray bottle. At that moment, I was completely frozen. My heart was hammering out of my chest. My head was spinning, and my hands were trembling as I looked at the sight, my eyes wide open in fear. When I finally regained some type of movement, I ran. I ran as fast as I could possibly run. When I got out of all of the rooms, I almost tripped running down the stairs. I sat down on the couch, breathing hard, and my hands still trembling. I think he heard me, because a few minutes later, he came downstairs. I don't even know how he looked so normal. I couldn't even look him in the eyes. "Hey, are you okay?" he said, looking concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Yeah, my dad's having an emergency," I lied. "I really need to go now. Sorry." I don't know what he said, because I quickly left his house and started walking to my house. I lived far away, so I didn't even know why I was walking. I guess I just wanted to clear my head. When I got home, I went straight to the bathroom. I sat there, bawling my eyes out and throwing up in the toilet occasionally. I haven't been to school since. I don't think I can face him again. I knew there was something off about him. I just don't get it. Was the room cold to preserve the skin? Wouldn't the skin be rotting by now? What actually is he? I don't think he's from Earth. I just want answers. Hurry up in the shower. We have to leave soon. I yelled towards the bathroom at my husband. Every year, at some point in the days leading up to Christmas, our families get together. We were already making bad timing when he realized he needed a shower. I had misplaced my earrings, paranoid about making us even later. As I walked past the bathroom, I noticed the door wide open. My husband stood there, still naked from having recently departed the shower. He had draped a pastel orange towel over his head, one that I didn't even know we owned. It didn't cross my mind at the time, just a fleeting thought. He swayed gently from side to side, like a swinging pendulum. I giggled. Stop being silly. You know we're running late. Have you seen my earrings? Immediately upon entering the bedroom, I spotted them gently glistening on the bedside table. Relieved, I yelled again. Never mind, I found them. As I put the first in, my gaze fell directly ahead of me, at the painting of a lighthouse hung on our bedroom wall. My husband was never a stranger to local markets. He almost had a talent for buying the strangest items. I've grown used to it, but this painting always stood out to me as a bizarre purchase. The lighthouse stands as the subject, with a series of indistinct colourful blobs painted around the bottom. A crowd of nondescript people, I had always assumed. On the frame, at the bottom, a title or note, or quote of some kind had been etched in. The Jolly Good Fellows. My trail of thought was cut short, as I failed to get the second earring in. I had stabbed myself slightly, and began to head to the bathroom for the assistance of the mirror. He was still standing there, swaying. "Honey, we really need to go soon. Please get ready." I approached the mirror. Seeing no blood, I breathed a sigh of relief and put the second earring in. The whole time, from the corner of my eye, I could still see him swaying. The towel blocked my view of his head. My patience was wearing thin. Had he even sorted his clothes out yet? "Honey, come on," I spoke as I lifted the towel from his face. Peering under, I expected to see him smiling, acting playfully. I felt a little bad, but being ever aware of the ticking clock, sometimes I have to remind him to have urgency, even when he's just playing around. His eyes were wide, his face emotionless. He stared forward as though there wasn't a wall a few feet from his face, like he was just a little past everything. He stopped swaying as the towel was removed, but remained in this state. I gently held his hand. "Come with me. Let's sit down." I knew something was wrong. As I guided him to the bed and sat him down, his arm felt limp, as though his muscles were void of any connection to the brain. "Let's get you some clothes, okay? We can talk about what's wrong." I tried to speak calmly as I turned around and searched through the wardrobe. I began asking questions, trying to take his mind off of things. My mind, while still aware of the time, was now more focused on my husband's well-being. Noticing a lack of answers or responses, I turned back to face him. "Have you ever jumped at the lack of something? Usually we jump at the sudden presence of something we were not expecting. Perhaps the sudden movement of an object we thought would remain motionless. But when I saw my husband wasn't behind me, my body jolted slightly. I hadn't heard him move, or felt him walk past me. I expected him to still be on the bed. The lack thereof was enough of a shift to shock me. "Honey?" I yelled slightly, wondering where he was. I walked past the bathroom. There he was. Orange towel draped over his head, swaying gently at the same rhythm as before. "If you don't respond to me, I'm calling an ambulance." I needed a quick answer. My mind jumped straight to some form of brain injury, perhaps from falling over in the shower. I knew that acting fast is the only chance you have to minimize damage. He didn't answer. I removed the towel from his head as I dialed emergency services. Again, he stopped swaying. As I explained everything to them, I watched as he knelt down, picked the towel back up, and draped it over his head. The swaying continued thereafter. Paramedics arrived shortly. He put up no fight, and allowed them to escort him to the ambulance in a wheelchair. I kept asking questions about whether he'd be okay. They had to keep assuring me that whilst the hospital would do everything they could, they had no information to go off of. My racing mind looked past this and continued to ask similar questions regardless. He kept trying to stand up whilst en route to the hospital, yet would be compliant when gently pushed back down. As long as someone was guiding him, he would follow. When this stopped, he would try to move. The same had happened back home. He only got up and left once I had sat him down and let go of him. Through the sound of the sirens wailing overhead, the bumps of the ambulance's journey, and trying to hold back my tears, I could hear a familiar tune. My husband, showing almost no other signs of activity, was gently humming. I leaned in to get a better listen. It was a very low tone, and each note seemed to begin as a hum, yet end as more of a raspy breath. Each one seemed to continue for slightly longer than they were supposed to, but I recognized this tune. He was humming, "For he's a jolly good fellow." Arriving at the hospital felt like a blur. Everyone knew exactly where they were going. I was following along, completely lost in the maze of signs and painted lines intended to guide. We had left the ambulance and arrived at his assigned bed before I could even process what was happening. As soon as he was laid down, the confusing blur continued. "Ma'am, could we borrow you in the next room? We just need you to fill out some paperwork." "Not until I know if my husband is okay," I snapped. "We understand, but the best chance at survival is if we understand everything. This paperwork will take care of some of that." I was assured that a doctor would be in the room shortly, and that my husband was in good hands. I shouldn't have listened. They certainly didn't. I explained that he kept trying to get up and walk about, but they clearly underestimated it. I hadn't even helped the lady fill out my husband's personal information before we were informed that he was missing. "He can't be far. Keep an eye on all entrances." The staff spoke to each other urgently. I was asked to remain calm and continue helping with the paperwork, but I refused. I attempted to run around the hospital to join the search, but was quickly told that I don't have the authority to be wandering around alone. I hardly cared. My husband was the only thing on my mind. But I didn't want to be escorted out and risk not seeing him at all when he's found. I took my efforts outside the hospital. I looked around the parking area, and then the nearby streets. After an hour and a half, I was still wondering, with no word from the hospital of any findings in the building. I began to walk home, hoping that somehow he had remembered the way. It was only a 20-minute walk. I could not imagine that he had survived in this state, let alone managed to correctly identify the entire journey home. But it was worth a shot. I arrived to find our front window smashed. No glass on the pavement below told me that somebody had broken in. Perhaps I should have been more cautious. but I just wanted to know if my husband was inside. My hand shook as I struggled to get the key into the lock. Once I did, I turned the handle and ran inside. I don't think I even closed the door behind me. "Honey, are you here?" I don't know if I was surprised to see what I saw, or whether I expected it. There he was, in the bathroom, orange towel draped over his head, swaying gently. This time, a pool of blood collected on the tiled floor below, dripping from his right arm. Cuts on his legs and torso told the full story. He had no concept of pain. He smashed the window to get in, to get back to this exact spot. The injuries meant nothing to him. For whatever reason, his mind was focused only on anchoring itself in that bathroom under the gentle weight of a towel. Crying, I approached him, and I lifted the towel slightly. I hardly even noticed the blood soaked into it. His eyes were so red. Had he even blinked since this began? The humming continued. I should have contacted emergency services immediately, but instead, I just stood there. I stared into his eyes, pretending he was staring back into mine. I wanted him back. Gently, he lifted an arm and pulled the towel back down over his face. I don't know how long I stood there, sobbing. "Please, talk to me. I love you." The gentle humming would have been comforting, but the slight inconsistency of the rhythm was a subtle reminder that my husband had no awareness. I thought back to all our recent conversations, everything we've ever done together. Lately, he's had a fascination with the ocean. I could never understand it. A horizon swallowed by the forever swaying and crashing of waves never appealed to me. He used to tell me all sorts of facts. One that particularly disturbed me was an old tradition of placing a towel over the faces of sailors who had passed whilst at sea. Once back on the shore, you'd place a towel over their face as you waited for somebody to arrive with help, or a hearse. Curiosity having a moment of breakthrough as I grieved my still living husband, I went into the bedroom. I took a closer look at the painting. The blobs at the bottom of the lighthouse. I had always assumed them to be nondescript people, with little detail added, though I had never understood why the blobs were so colourful. Only then did I realize they were not a crowd gathering at the bottom of the lighthouse. They were dozens of bodies, laid out on the shore. Pastel-coloured towels were draped over their faces. Perhaps my husband is there now, forever visiting the lighthouse, staring into the horizon as it's swallowed by the ocean. Since I was a kid, I've been receiving Christmas gifts from someone named Uncle Gabe. It's always been a mystery to me and my family, because I have no uncle that goes by that name. The presents aren't anything sinister or nefarious. It's just a normal gift that anyone would receive. It first happened when I was about 8 years old. There we were, me and my family, sitting around the Christmas tree early in the morning. Everyone all too eager to unravel their gifts. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Me and my brothers received the usual presents from each other and of course our parents. Envelopes passed out to each one of us with money inside, a special treat given to us by our grandparents. By this point, we were all playing with our new items, thinking our annual ceremony was over. But that's when my brother Peter pointed out the extra gift. It was shoved behind the back of the tree. We all turned to see what my little brother was pointing out, and sure enough, there was indeed one more gift. Me and my brothers looked at each other, all pondering the premise of who the gift was for. I remember my mother jabbing my dad in his side, asking with befuddlement of where it came from. My father had no answers, and he displayed as much bewilderment as the rest of us. My father approached cautiously and reached his arm underneath the tree. He pulled out the gift, it being a medium-sized rectangular box. My father gestured to my mum for her to hand him his reading glasses. Me and my brothers remained silent, waiting anxiously to see who would receive the extra gift. My father then rushed over to my mother while holding the present. Quietly, he whispered something into her ear, only for her to shake her head in disagreement. I remember in that moment crossing my fingers, hoping the gift was for me. I was a bit selfish, but when I was little, nothing more would have satisfied me like having one more present to open in front of my brothers. My dad then cleared his throat, and with a bit of a shaky tone, lifted the box and handed it to me, telling me it was from Uncle Gabe. "Who's that?" I remember asking. "I'm not sure, son. Maybe it's from one of your mother's brothers," my father told me, though right away I heard my mother protest the notion. I think my parents were concerned that something inappropriate might have been in the mystery box, but I think they didn't want to alarm any of us, so they reluctantly told me to open it. Being young, I didn't see anything wrong. All I knew was that there was another gift for me to open, and better yet, the envious faces from my brothers was the icing on the cake. I tore into the perfectly wrapped gift with such a jovial spirit, the sound of paper shredding fluttering into my ears as my intrigue morphed into pure wonderment. My eyes were fixated on every movement my small hands were making, while my entire family circled around me, their eyes penetrating through the back of my head. Sharp gasps poured out of the mouths of my brothers, because to all of our astonishment, the gift was a brand new Nintendo. The original, and back then it was a present that was usually reserved for families that had money, which we didn't. It was the whole kit. It came with the NES Zapper and the combo game Duck Hunt and Mario. A small note was attached inside. The handwriting was poetic, beautifully written, something you would see done by some master calligrapher. Enjoy Duck Hunt. It's quite the game. Uncle Gabe. It read. I was too all enthralled with the present to notice the argument that was unfolding behind me. My parents debated if this were some mistake. Maybe the gift was for some other family. That something this expensive couldn't have been for us. Right away, my brothers tried to wrestle the box away from me, and quickly, we all got into a bit of a scuffle, trying to claim ownership over the game system. Finally, my father intervened and told us that we had to share it. He came to the conclusion that this mistake was something for the family to benefit from, especially on Christmas. I quickly fell in love with the game Duck Hunt. Something about holding the small gun in my hand felt natural. I would aim at the screen at ease and take down several ducks without even blinking. This was only the start when it came to receiving gifts from Uncle Gabe. The next year I was sent several Nerf guns, the most expensive ones on the market, the kind that were fully automatic. I was sent several, enough for me and my brothers to play together. As the year prior, it too came with a small note. Practice makes perfect. Uncle Gabe. It remained a mystery, but my father took the gifts, thinking it was some error done by a delivery service. Or, in his mind, better, it was a mistake by some entitled rich person. He had a bit of disdain for the wealthy, always thinking it was their fault that he had made all the wrong life choices. As the years passed, the gifts piled up, each one outdoing the last, at least in cost value, much to my father's delight. All the gifts were accompanied by a small note written by Uncle Gabe himself. By the time I had reached my teen years, I had a collection of video games and Nerf guns, all with every accessory you could imagine. When I turned 15, I received my first BB gun. And if you don't know what that is, it's a rifle that uses pressure to shoot out small BBs, something that could be considered dangerous if used with malevolent intent. The note that was slivered in between the wrapping paper and box was a bit more ominous than usual. Here is where the real fun begins. Uncle Gabe. This is where my father drew the line. The presents went from harmless to mischievous. He didn't want to take any chances at his boys hurting each other. To be honest, I was disappointed. I was all too enthralled in the nature of guns. Practicing with virtual weapons and Nerf ones no longer satiated my hunger, though I dare not argue with my father. Instead, I remember waiting for him to throw out my new rifle in the dumpster, only for me to retrieve it once everyone else was asleep. This went on for the next incoming years. The present from Uncle Gabe would be under the tree, only showing up the morning of Christmas. I remember seeing how frustrated my father was. I could practically see the small veins leading up to his eyes burst from anger. No longer was it a simple mistake. Now, it was an intrusion. One my old man didn't appreciate. He once again threw away the present before I even had a chance to open it. My brothers, at this point, lost all interest in the mystifying puzzle. It really only came down to my parents and me. Like the year before, I had to wait for my parents to fall asleep, and then I went to retrieve the gift from the dumpster. This time it was heavy. I knew right away that this was going to be a good one. As I tore into the gift, I had the odd sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood firm, and I turned in all directions, thinking I had been caught. But there was no one. This time, it was a welding kit. Something that took me by surprise. It was for beginners. All the essentials were there. A small booth with a welding kit and a few metals. I didn't know what to think. I had never shown any interest in crafting my own metals, so, as usual, I opened the small note that came attached. Remember, things aren't always available. Uncle Gabe. I lived with my parents for a few more years, before moving to a new city because of work. I remember having to hide the gift from Uncle Gabe before my parents would see it, and much to their thrill, the mysterious gift had halted, and all reassurance of any sinister unraveling was unbeknownst to them. As I grew into the man I would become, the presents kept coming, and I remember pondering if there would ever be an end. Would the gifts still arrive long after my own demise? Would my kids then receive them? These were questions I wanted answering. I needed to communicate with whoever Uncle Gabe was. I left multiple notes under the tree, as if the man himself was Santa, just wanting some explanation of who he was. It was obvious he was not my uncle. But what did he expect of me? I never got a response. I just continued receiving gifts from the man. Some years it were knives with a sharpening kit, and other times it were a bow and arrow. At my age, I was already too engulfed in the idea of weaponry, and even without Uncle Gabe's gifts, I built up quite an artillery. I owned several handguns, along with plenty of rifles. If anything, it was because of Uncle Gabe that my fascination with weapons grew. This Christmas was a bit different than normal. As usual, I received Uncle Gabe's gift underneath the tree. I opened it without any hesitation. But the box was empty. Nothing was inside. Nothing other than the usual note. And this one left me a bit perturbed. It's almost time. Uncle Gabe. What did he mean by it was almost time? Was it almost time to meet him? Why wasn't there no actual gift? The questions almost drove me insane, and a sense of uneasiness invaded every fiber of my body. I didn't know if my family was in danger, though if so, I had plenty of ammo to protect them. That's what brings me to today. Me, sitting here, recording this to the outside world, if there is still one. I received one more present from my Uncle Gabe. It was wrapped as beautiful as the first one I had received. It's shining brighter than the moon itself. But this time, there was no tree. It was no longer Christmas. Instead, it was New Year's Day. I found it carefully placed on my dining room table, my curiosity bursting. though my mind understanding this was something new. I was a bit hungover from the New Year's Eve, my head throbbing and my throat dry. My wife was still asleep. There was no one to stop me from opening it. This present that was more mysterious than the first one I had received. I tore into the wrapping, shredding it without any concern. Per usual, a small note laid inside. Before reading it, I opened the box. The scent of metal inundating my nostrils. I couldn't believe my eyes. It couldn't be what I thought it was. I then turned my attention to the small note. The words, sending chills down my spine. It was simple. It was menacing. It read, "Survive. Uncle Gabe." Alright, where to begin? This is weird, but I had a friend in college named Russell. This guy thought he was God's gift to women. He was always striving to be the center of attention. He loved the spotlight more than anything. Until one spring afternoon, a quiet professor named Dr. Wang brought his world crashing down. Dr. Wang pointed out, in front of the entire lecture hall, that the Japanese tattoo that he thought was cool was actually Chinese and was utterly ridiculous. "No, it means freedom," he laughed nervously as everybody stared at him. "I assure you, that tattoo is in Hanzi, and it says Mianfei, free of charge." I remembered the whole room erupting in laughter at my cocky friend, while he stood there, speechless. You know, though, what the absolute worst part of everything was? Russell acted like he didn't even give a shit. He kept the mistranslated tattoo, and never once acted ashamed of it. He owned that monstrosity. I thought about this college story that morning as I pulled away the white bandage from my sore upper cheek. Underneath some saran-wrapped goop, I found myself staring at a tiny tattoo. A permanent tattoo right on my fucking face. This was 2 weeks ago, when this whole insane ordeal started. The night before I got uncharacteristically drunk with an ex-girlfriend, and woke up alone at my place, with this thing on my face. It took a good half hour before I could stop hyperventilating and calm down to take a realistic assessment of the damage. In all honesty, the tattoo was quite small. A small tat in that black ink in the shape of a small eye. I honestly had no clue how I got the idea to get that stamped on my face. The simple eye was about the size of a tear, and about half an inch below my actual lower right eye. Below that was some kind of Lego shape, and then to the right of that Lego shape was a familiar but more detailed shape that looked like a small person kneeling. Altogether, the thing is maybe 3/4 of an inch in diameter. I called my ex, who was anything but a morning person. She swore up and down that it was all my idea. I was drunk and was searching on my phone for the perfect tat. Apparently, that is the masochistic thing I settled on. It'll be fine. This is 2023. My manager at work has arm sleeve tattoos, and it has done nothing to hurt his career. This isn't the 1900s, dude. She told me. I ended up calling sick into work that day. I just couldn't stomach the thought of everyone at the company staring at the new guy with this awful tattoo. I wondered whether they would think I was in some kind of strange gang. I just didn't think I could face anyone. The following morning, though, I got up, got dressed, and headed off to work to face the music. I ventured into my boss's office to break the news, and braced for the inevitable backlash. Nice. I don't think I've seen anything like that. Oh, before I forget, do you want to sign this birthday card for Vanessa? He said, somewhat distractedly. Maybe it wouldn't be that bad, I thought after that. My boss, the only one whose opinion really mattered, didn't seem to care. Nobody else really looked as I walked to my desk. Admittedly, though, I spent most of the time strategically covering it with my hand. Once I sat down, I relaxed a bit more and started my work. It was mid-morning, and still an hour or so until lunch, when I noticed Lindsay staring. She swiveled around in her chair so that she was facing directly into my cubicle. Her mouth was slightly open, and her face was frozen expressionless. Her eyes, though, burned daggers right into mine. I smiled awkwardly, and my adrenaline jumped. Hey, what's up? I said to her, and waited for her to ask about my tattoo. She didn't move. In fact, she didn't move for the next 5 freaking minutes, as I waited for her to speak. In fact, I waited for her to do anything, really. But no. She just continued to stare motionlessly at my face, like she was trying to win some unagreed-upon staring contest. So, I did what any rational, mature adult does in a weird situation. I awkwardly shifted back to my computer and pretended to work, ignoring my rude cubicle neighbor. Without even looking, I could feel her gaze on me for a while, itching my face as I wondered how long she could keep this pointless charade up. After a while, I actually settled into getting some real work done. About an hour later, when I was getting ready to go to lunch, I stood up and fully intended to walk out of my cubicle and head straight to my car. I would not give this weirdo the satisfaction of glancing in her direction. I just couldn't do it, though. I couldn't help myself. I peeked at her quickly and yelled in surprise. Lindsay was still staring right fucking at me, as drool was running down her chin. It's like she hadn't moved the entire time. I walked over to her in order to ask her what was going on, and her head followed my path. At least she wasn't dead. Lindsay? Are you okay? Why are you, staring at me? She didn't move. She stared right at the tattoo on my face. Heading to lunch. Where are you treating me? Caleb from Contracts asked as he walked down the row of cubicles that I found myself standing in. Dude, what is going on with Lindsay? Do you see this? She will not stop staring at me. I asked him in exasperation. What's going on? He asked. I pointed and looked back to her frozen form. She made no attempt to move whatsoever. When I looked back to Caleb, he was facing me directly. He was staring straight at me, with that same blank, soulless expression. Fuck. I mumbled and sprinted off to the bathroom. I checked out my reflection in the mirror, and the only thing I could see was the area on my cheek with the tattoo was a little clearer and not as red. No sign of infection. I left the office and didn't come back to work for the rest of the afternoon. The next day, I worked from home, and things were a bit better. I made an emergency appointment for tattoo laser removal, but they were pretty booked. The next time they could see me was in a few weeks, so I'd have to deal with it for the time being. Plus, I was warned it usually takes several sessions to significantly dissolve the ink. Maybe I was overthinking everything, but I swear I could feel everyone at the office talking about me. At this point, my tattoo was basically healed. It had that scribbled-on look, like someone ran up to me on the street and drew this right on my face with a ballpoint pen. I guess if I was a rapper, it might be kind of cool. Instead, I was some guy that spent most of his time trying to avoid attention. The next morning, I pretty much accepted my ordeal with this whole thing. I thought, if I'm stuck with this thing, I might as well dress a bit cooler. So, instead of the slightly overdressed business casual that I normally wear, I put on some trendy cargo pants and a loud pink fleece jacket that screamed, "Look at me." If people were going to be looking, I figure I'd go all out. No room for embarrassment if I was rocking my edgy look. At work that day, 5 people were waiting in the lobby. I never really noticed before how harsh the lighting was in the building, but in that unwelcoming lobby, with 5 other employees all staring at me, I realized how deathly white and blaring the lights were shining on me. "What's up, losers?" I said casually to the unresponsive gawkers. I thought, maybe I could actually live with this for the next month or so if needed. "Wow, you're looking sharp." That voice, the voice of an angel named Dina, caught me off guard. Dina is someone that is, without any doubt, 100% out of my league. She surprised me as she walked in just after I did. "Oh, thanks. You too," I told her, completely devoid of any riz whatsoever. I couldn't believe it though. Dina and I started talking later that day. I even built up enough courage to ask her out to dinner. I was surprised when she said yes, but even more surprised that she insisted we go out that evening. The hastily set up date went great. She did most of the talking while I quickly and silently fell in love with her. She talked about her family, growing up in the Middle East, moving to the States for college. She was actually really interesting. Don't ask me how I did it, but we ended up back at her place. Do you mind if I give you a massage? She told me unexpectedly. Are you kidding? Not at all. I told her. I was on the bed without my shirt. She wasn't done surprising me though. She pulled out some overpoweringly fragrant essential oils or something and started rubbing that on my back. It was way too strong of a smell, but I went along with it. I won't go into graphic details, but we slept together that night. I couldn't believe my luck. What started off as the worst week ever was turning into the best. I had a dream though that night that was somewhat disturbing. I dreamt that I was somewhere dark, completely pitch black, like I was in some kind of void. I couldn't move at all. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. This felt like it lasted for hours, until I could see a faint light in the distance. It looked like some kind of ship that was sailing away. I woke up, and immediately I could tell something was wrong. Dina was sort of kneeling over me and holding something to my nose. I could feel it push deep into my nostril as she whispered, "Niwen, diwetak, wasir." She was fucking stabbing something into my nostril. I pushed her off and immediately scrambled up and bolted for the door. I looked back and saw her standing there, completely calm. "Anak pauchem, ek weser," she said. She was holding a fucking chopstick in her hand. Worse, she looked horrifyingly calm for someone that had just tried to stab that thing up my nose. "Dina, what the hell?" I screamed at her. I was halfway out of the bedroom door, but stood there waiting. I was absolutely terrified of her. Her face then shifted completely from one of calm to intense worry. She dropped the chopstick and then started to breathe rapidly. "What? Was I sleeping? Shit, I'm so sorry. I haven't had a sleepwalking incident in so long. I'm really sorry," she said before she broke out in a fit of sobs. She looked so sad and vulnerable. I couldn't just leave her there. I realized when I was looking at her that I was already hopelessly in love with her. Her reaction seemed genuine, but I didn't know. I couldn't just leave her there, so I played it off and said it was nothing. Eventually we got back into bed, and she cried on my shoulder. She eventually fell asleep while I stared at the ceiling the whole night. Obviously, I couldn't do anything close to falling asleep that night after that. It felt good though, just to be there for her. Anyway, that's the story. It's only been a week, but she hasn't had another incident since then. I think that's a good sign, right? Am I being crazy or what? Do you think she might be trying to kill me? Or is this all some big misunderstanding? Elle died in labor, forcing the doctors to cut our babies out of the womb in an emergency C-section. She knew it was a risky pregnancy, but decided to keep them despite protests from doctors and myself. They say a woman becomes a mother the moment she gets pregnant, and a man becomes a father when he sees his kids for the first time. And it's true. Elle would have done anything for her unborn children, and she ended up giving her life for theirs. I was never depressed in the delivery room. Instead, I raged. Raged at Elle for going through with the pregnancy. I raged at the 2 babies whose deliveries killed my wife. I raged at the doctors, and I raged at God. But all of the anger melted away as soon as I saw my 2 beautiful babies. I became a father in that moment. It killed me that Brady and Emily would never know the wonderful, intelligent woman that their mother was, or would ever fully understand what she sacrificed for them. But I vowed to make Elle proud in raising them. They were, after all, the only piece of Elle I had left. When I brought the twins home from the hospital 2 days later, the television was on in the living room. We must have left it on during the hurry to get out of the house when Elle's water broke. I moved across the room to turn the TV off, when the commercial break ended and the television showed the scheduled program. House Hunters on HGTV. Elle's favorite. That's what finally broke me. I dropped to my knees in the living room and bawled my eyes out. Repressed emotion poured out of me in buckets. I hadn't cried like that in my entire life. I probably could have carried on for days, but one of the babies started crying, and I snapped out of it. I had people depending on me now. I needed to be strong for them. The first few weeks were stressful as shit. I was tired and didn't read as much of the baby books as I should have. I had no idea what I was doing and felt like I was drowning. Put one baby down and the other one starts crying. I needed help. I called Elle's mum, and she was giddy to come over and help mother her grandchildren. She stayed with us for a week, showing me the ropes. How to swaddle, test the temperature of milk, change a diaper. I couldn't have done it without her. She even reminded me of a few old nursery rhymes from my childhood that I had completely forgotten about. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from the babies keeping me up at all hours. I woke up sometime in the early hours of the morning, in total darkness, and heard from the baby monitor the soft singing of a lullaby. I rubbed my eyes and headed upstairs to thank my mother-in-law and send her back to bed when I passed by the front of the house and noticed her car wasn't in the driveway. I remembered then that she had left the day before. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I listened to the voice from the baby monitor. It sounded like Elle's, but a little gravelly, like she'd picked up smoking in the afterlife. I slowly made my way up the stairs and down the hall to the nursery. Standing outside of the door, I could hear the quiet singing and even make out the sound of a few soft footsteps of whoever it was walking around the room. I reached for the doorknob and readied myself to burst into the room. The second my hand touched the knob, the singing came to an abrupt stop, and then I heard a thump, followed by a burst of cries from my children. I exploded into the room, ready to dispatch whoever was in there. But the room was empty, except for Brady wasn't in his crib. He was on the floor, on the other side of the room, just outside of the closet door. I quickly scooped him up and put him back into his crib before tearing the closet door open, only to find nothing but the stockpile of blankets and diapers I'd loaded in there myself. I went back to my son and comforted him until he went back to sleep. The next few weeks were uneasy. I was getting less and less sleep. Each night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was hearing footsteps or raspy breathing through the baby monitor, only to rush into the nursery to find nothing but my own sleeping babies. I thought I was going crazy. Once more I called for backup, and my mother-in-law was over in an hour. That night, I went to sleep early, only to wake up to the sound of crying coming from the baby monitor. It wasn't Brady or Emily. It was my mother-in-law. I rushed into the nursery to find her in the chair, reading a piece of paper, with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you," she said. "I forgot there was a baby monitor in here." "It's okay," I replied. "What's wrong? What are you reading?" She extended the paper out to me. "I just found this." I took it from her and quickly read it. "Jesus, Susan," I said to her. "Where did you find this?" "It was in the closet. I found it when I was looking for some new diapers. It was just out in the open. I'm not sure how I didn't find it last week." It was a note from Elle, addressed directly to her mother. It thanked her for taking care of her children, and apologized for making the decision to sacrifice herself for Brady and Emily. The words were all very kind and loving, but for some reason it made me think of a suicide note. I guess if she wrote this before she died, then, in a sense, it sort of was. The note was hard on Susan. She left the next day, taking the letter with her. That afternoon I was up in the nursery, feeding my kids, when I heard voices from downstairs. I put the babies back into their cribs and rushed downstairs to find that the TV was on again. House Hunters. My skin crawled. I turned off the television and started to head back upstairs when I heard the voice through the baby monitor again, singing that same lullaby as a few nights ago. I sprinted into the nursery to find Brady and Emily, right where I had left them. But I also found something new. On the floor outside of the closet door was a note, this time addressed to me. I opened it. "You're doing an amazing job. I know this is hard, and you never thought it would come to this. But I'm proud of you, and I always knew you'd be an incredible father. But you won't have to be. I'm going to take Brady and Emily with me soon. You've gone above and beyond for them like you always did for me, and I know you're hurting now, and it's going to hurt even worse when you lose Brady and Emily. But you just have to trust me. This is for their own sake. I love you forever. L. I called the police, who searched the entire house and found nothing. I didn't want to believe it was Elle. I wanted to believe she was in heaven. I wanted to believe she was at peace. I wanted to move forward with my life. But this just made letting go so much harder. That night, I moved Brady and Emily's cribs into my room, and we slept with the door locked, which didn't seem to help, because I woke up that night to more singing. I sat up in bed and put my glasses on, scanning the dark room. It appeared to be completely empty, save for myself and the twins. But when I focused in on the source of the lullaby and really concentrated on it, it almost seemed like there was a part of the room that was darker than the rest of it. A shadow in the shape of a woman, gently swaying back and forth as it hummed a gentle lullaby above my son's crib. I squinted hard in the low light and tried to make out a face, if only because it would ease my broken heart to see Elle's face one last time. I had no luck. The black void in front of me continued to sway side to side, humming quietly. I almost started to hum along when the shape bent at the waist and a long black arm reached down into Brady's crib. Terrified, I jumped out of bed and hit the lights, only to find the room deserted. Whatever had cast that shadow was gone now. I checked on my kids and laid back in bed, shaking with fear. Eventually the feeling subsided, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke up to another note in Brady's crib. He's sick. He needs to come with me. He's sick? What did that mean? I took the twins to the doctor that afternoon. They were perfectly healthy. Brady was dead the next day. The doctor said it was SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Only I knew it was Elle. No one can really describe grief. The pit in your stomach, the membrane that forms between you and the rest of the world. You get lost in your own head, and you dread the company of others, while at the same time fear the idea of being alone. In intervals, I felt drunk or concussed, then blind with rage, then numb. A complete disinterest of the world around me settled in, and I carried on in autopilot for the next few days. My world was crashing down around me, and I didn't even want to look up. Then I found another note. I'm sorry, but they need to come with me. It's for their own sake. I know it's hard for you, but think of the sacrifice I made. We all need to make sacrifices for the greater good. Love you forever. Elle. I tore a piece of paper out of a nearby notebook and scribbled a note back. Your sacrifice. You've been dead for a few months, and now you're just going to take them with you and leave me alone. You didn't sacrifice anything. You're being selfish. Leave me and Emily alone. I laid in bed for hours, numb to the world, only rising to feed and cradle Emily when she cried. The next morning, I found another note. I'm sorry. I am. This is hurting me as much as it hurts you. Please believe me. Being on the other side of the veil, I can see things you can't. Brady wouldn't have lasted 3 years. His first and only memories would have been of pain and agony. He would have known nothing but suffering in his life. It's better he came with me. I'm so sorry, but it's the truth. Emily is going to have a short and brutal life. Sickness, injury, disease. She'll have more experience with inflammation and needles than princesses and tea parties. I'm doing what is best for our children. I am showing 2 innocent souls mercy. I love you forever. L. I scribbled another note back. They're my kids too. Please. It's been 8 years since I wrote that note. And she was right. Emily hasn't had an easy life. Meningitis, a car accident, and now cancer. Pain has been a constant companion of hers. I'm looking at her now, lying in her hospital bed, tubes snaking out of her arms and nose, and I'm trying to think of the good times. Pushing her wheelchair through the zoo, watching her roar at the lions, the birthday party when she was so happy about her Ninja Turtle pajamas that she cried, the times I fell asleep on her bedroom floor, reading her bedtime stories. I wouldn't have traded it for the world. But it's times like these when I'm afraid she won't make it through the night, that I'm terrified I didn't do enough, that when her life flashes before her eyes, it will be nurses and IV bags instead of butterflies, sunshine, and Saturday morning pancakes. I get a small piece of comfort knowing that she has a wonderful mother waiting for her on the other side. But it still eats me inside. Can someone, please, tell me I made the right choice? Just outside of the town I live in, there is a massively, densely wooded park that is largely forgotten. It's not that people don't know it's there, but it's simply more of an afterthought. It's not ideal for hiking. It doesn't have any kid-friendly play areas, or even a pond to attempt fishing in. What it essentially amounts to is miles and miles of wooded area. But me and my college buddy Derek had long known about something that lay deep within the park, and we had finally built up the courage and resources to explore it. Derek had always been into this type of thing since I met him a few years before at the start of college. Although we didn't know each other for that long, we quickly became best friends, forming a connection like I'd never had with anyone before. Despite that, he was the type of person who would keep a lot of stuff buried deep. I never blamed him for it, as his usual coping mechanisms tended to be positive, such as going to the gym or writing. But when his sister passed away a few months prior, I didn't hear from him for a week. One day he finally returned my calls, and he had only one thing to say. Henderson Park, this summer. We are going to find it. At the beginning of summer break, we began our hike. After a couple hours of trekking on a route which we had planned and charted out for months, we finally made it to the spot. It was a clearing spanning a couple 100 meters in area, and once we made it past the last of the foliage, it didn't take but a second to identify what we had come for. In the middle of this open patch lay a large building, abandoned to time and worn down by nature. But yet it stood, beckoning us to enter. The abandoned structure of Henderson Park had been a legend in this town since I could remember. No one knows how it got there, or what it used to be. It was simply a massive building, miles deep into the wilderness, with no documentation or history. I almost didn't believe it was real, but we had found someone previously who had made a detailed map of the park. We decided if the structure was there, we were going to find it. There it is, Sam. Glad to see we didn't come all this way for nothing, Derek said as we rested for a moment to catch our breath. You act as if we hadn't done our research, I responded, secretly as relieved as he was. There was always the possibility, after all, that the building had withered away, or that a small mistake in navigation would send us off the path. But, luckily, we had found our destination with relative ease. We took the moment to look up at it while we gathered our bearings, and documented it with some pictures. It stood tall with at least 3 floors, and had plenty of surface area. It appeared like it had been an old school or hospital of some sort, based on its layout. Its exterior was a dark grey, tainted by the decay and moss creeping around it. Despite the wear and tear, there was a surprising lack of graffiti or any signs of human tampering. Well, you ready to see what's in there? I said, breaking the silence. Derek turned to me, a look of worry appearing on his face. No, I think we should head back. He then flashed me a big grin and began to make his way to the structure. I followed, trying to ignore his stupid joke. We made our way to the entrance doors and noted that they appeared to be missing, the only remaining evidence being some scattered pieces of glass. I noted at this point that besides the obvious weathering of time, this building did not seem old at all. In fact, it was as if a building from the modern day had been left to the whims of nature for a century. Before I could ponder this in too much detail, we continued inward, and quickly the darkness began to consume our vision. Derek turned on his flashlight, illuminating the hallway directly in front of us. It was lined with abandoned lockers and debris, which covered most of the doorways. most of the paths on this floor appeared to be blocked off, or just seemed a bit unstable due to damaged pillars and missing walls. We explored what little we could safely access, until finally coming upon a set of stairs that could have either taken us up to the second floor, or downwards, towards what I assumed was a basement area. We wanted to start somewhere, and work our way through the building seamlessly. That inevitably left us with a decision. Should we go upstairs, or explore the basement first? Finally, Derek spoke up. Dude, I think we should split up. You can't be serious. How are we going to explore both at the same time? It's the only way, he insisted. Derek, I'm kidding, man. Come on, let's start downstairs, and we can work our way up, Derek said, descending the stairs before I could even respond. The stairs proved to be much deeper than we thought. What I assumed was going to take us one floor down felt more like 100. After walking down the stairs for what felt like 10 minutes, I spoke up. Hey, man, this is kind of ridiculous. How deep does this staircase go? I don't know, Sam. It's kind of freaking me out, to be honest. But I nodded in agreement. Derek did seem to be getting genuinely concerned for the first time during this trip. But we were on the same page. We had to keep going at this point. Whether this staircase was bottomless, or a descent into hell itself, we were going to see the end of it. Luckily, it turned out to be neither of those things, because a few minutes later, we hit the bottom. Well, good news is that if one of us gets hurt, the other only needs to drag them up 70 flights of stairs, Derek joked, although the thought only made me feel uneasy. The area we found ourselves in would probably be best compared to that of a subway tunnel. Well, without the actual train tracks. What lay before us was simply a long, vacant tunnel with concrete walls and flooring, and no end in sight. I was beginning to feel like we were out of our depth here. However, I didn't think to protest, as Derek began walking down into the tunnel. At least, not until we began to hear something echoing deep within the tunnel. We immediately stopped dead in our tracks. What sounded like a high-pitched synth had begun ringing through the tunnel. The echoing was making me feel queasy as it reverberated through my body. It paused for a moment, before resuming. Every few seconds, another tone, ringing out like a beacon, progressively getting louder, and presumably closer. The sounds started to become ear-piercing, and before I knew it, I was on my knees, holding my ears, barely withstanding the sharp ringing throughout my head. Just as I thought I was going to black out from the sheer intensity of it, the sound stopped in an instant. I looked over to Derek, who was also recovering from the auditory assault. We both shared a glance and a nod. Our curiosity had seemingly run its course, and we started to quickly head back from the way we came. I was unsure of how to rationalize what had just happened, but all I knew is that I would prefer not to experience whatever that was. any closer. That's when we heard something else from within the tunnel. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Our speed walk quickly escalated into a jog, and then a run. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but I had some serious doubts that many other people were exploring this place, and especially wandering through this forsaken tunnel. And so we ran. And ran. We hadn't been walking down the tunnel for more than a minute. There was no way we were that far away from the stairs. Yet again, it felt like we were in an endless loop with no end in sight. But then we found it. We stopped and looked at the staircase as we caught our breath. So, Derek began, trying to form his thoughts. I walked up to the foot of the stairs and put my hands on the large chunks of rubble that now blocked our only exit off. I didn't even have the energy to freak out, or to scream. I slumped down, staring at the rubble, as if my gaze alone could alter the grim reality we were faced with. That sound. It had to have caused something to collapse, Derek said, trying to rationalize the situation, as if that would make anything better. Derek, we're going to die down here, I said weakly. Before he could respond, we remembered why we were running. The footsteps were now within 20 feet of us, and we had nowhere to run. We both turned our gaze to the direction they were coming from. Whatever it was seemed to be hidden in the shadows, and neither of us wanted to see what was approaching. I could just barely make the outline of a shambling figure, moving erratically and twitching violently with each step. We nodded to each other, seemingly on the same page that if we were to die here, we were at least going to put up a fight. But after taking a deep breath, Derek lifted his flashlight and pointed it towards the figure. Derek was lost for words, as was I. There stood Emily, Derek's sister. She appeared to be bruised and beaten, covered in scratches, wearing tattered clothing. But Emily had died earlier that year. This didn't make any sense, why she would be alive, let alone down here. Emily, I thought you were... Derek struggled to find words as his tears began to well up. Emily weakly smiled, clearly having been through hell. But something was wrong. She had stopped moving. She looked like she could barely stand. Her head was lowered, as if she couldn't lift it. I tried to look into her eyes. Derek? She said weakly. Derek began to walk towards her, his arms open wide, ready to embrace her. It all played out in slow motion as he neared her. I didn't have time to warn him. I didn't have time to tell him to stop, as I noticed the hollow blackness of what should be her eyes. The hellish grin that she could hardly contain. She grabbed him and met his gaze. I can't get the image out of my head. of the look of terror on my best friend's face as he looked into the abyss that were that creature's eyes. And then she unhinged her jaw beyond the point of reason, latching onto Derek as he began to scream. But he didn't have the chance to make a sound as the creature closed its jaws over his head. I ran. Without thinking, I left my friend to his fate, knowing full well he was already dead. I ran, and I kept running. I don't know what I was thinking, or where I was running to. The synth began to reverberate throughout the tunnel, and the ear-splitting ringing began to return, escalating until my body was numb, and I couldn't sense where I was. I suddenly snapped back into consciousness, my head still ringing. I lay at the entrance of the structure. It was still bright outside. I sat up, trying to regain my senses. I had no idea what happened. I don't know if I blacked out and somehow found an exit, but that didn't seem likely. I still had my bag with me, with water and food. I could make it back by night if I started hiking. And that's what I did. I reported Derek missing and explained that we got split up during the hike. It's not an uncommon thing for people to go missing on long treks through parks of this size, so it seemed reasonable. I haven't mentioned the structure to anyone until now, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. What if Derek somehow survived? I feel like he is calling to me. I feel like I need to help him. I know I shouldn't, but something is telling me to go back. To go back to the structure.
Hello, Sinister listeners. If you've enjoyed this story, then you'll find all the author's information in the description below. For more content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to succumb to the sinister.